You're listening to the Justin Beahm Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Radio Hour podcast, episode 31. I am your host, Justin Beahm. This episode is really close to my heart. Crispin Glover is one of my all-time favorite actors. He elevates every film he's in, whether he's the lead or in a supporting role, and it is an incredible honor to have had the conversation you're about to hear with Crispin years ago. This was 2019, and I had pitched a story to editor Chris Alexander at Fangoria about the career and current cinema activity of Crispin Glover, a favorite actor of mine, someone that I have great reverence for, and Chris was all in from the beginning. Little did either of us know how open Crispin would end up being in this conversation. When I first reached out to Crispin, he was a little bit trepidatious about the interview just because he wasn't particularly fond of the media and how he had been presented historically. He was also very much into sort of vetting the people who were interviewing him. So it took a long time for him to come back to me and open the doors to a conversation for print, let alone for this show, eventually many, many years later. So what ended up transpiring, as you're about to hear, was an expansive several hours of discussion about all kinds of topics, from personal to professional. He opened up to me about the Back to the Future lawsuit, which he says was the first time that he was really willing to talk about that. He talks about his early days in interest in cinema through his dad and through television, ultimately, which was his sort of earliest exposure to any kind of entertainment medium on the acting side. It's a really transparent interview that I think sort of stands alone because, again, Crispin doesn't do much media, and he isn't as open as he is during signing events and screening events to people coming up, and he will see everybody in the line through to the end, no matter how long that takes. He's not really open to the media. So it remains one of the greatest honors of my career to have had this discussion with him. And I think you're going to find a lot of incredible stories. We talk about Friday the 13th, Part 4. We get into his early films like Orkley Kid. We talk about his later films, as I mentioned, Back to the Future. Also sprinkled in here are some of his rare leading roles. So I don't want to spoil too much for you on the front end here, but I do want to encourage you to check out the entire interview here with Crispin, and I certainly hope you enjoy it. I should set the stage for this a little bit. I had written to Crispin, and he had agreed to an interview, initially only through text, so I had sent him an email with some questions that he did respond to, and then it quickly transitioned into, well, you know what, maybe we should have a conversation about this stuff. He mentioned he had vetted me, had read some of my previous work in Fangoria, and I was, just beyond honored that he had gone to such an extent to find out if he was open to this discussion with me. And then it became a bit of a waiting game where I was hoping to hear from Crispin day after day. And like so many stories go, I had kind of given up the idea that he would be reaching out to me. Several emails had gone unanswered. And then all of a sudden, about 2 a.m. my time, I get a phone call. And the following is what transpired. It was an extensive discussion about his entire career where he was so completely open. The other sides of this piece were intended to include his dad, Bruce Glover. The Bruce stories are a whole unique thing unto themselves. I don't know that I have audio of those, but I'm going to try to dig for them. I had asked Bruce if he would pitch in on this piece thinking that he would be a great voice in the story of Crispin's arc, of course. I mean, Bruce is a legend, and who has better perspective on his son's work than him as his dad, and this sort of century that enabled Crispin entrance into the world of cinema performance. So Bruce always called me around 2 or 3 in the morning. It would inevitably be, I'd be in the middle of the night, dead asleep, and my phone would ring. I answer it, and it's Bruce. And this is why I think I probably don't have any audio recording of this, because it literally was in the middle of the night every time he called, which is probably 3 or 4 times. And he'd call me and he'd say, Justin, Bruce Glover, I'm glad you're a vampire like me. I thought a little bit more about the situation with Crispin. I have some more stories for you. And then he would go on to regale me with his tales of Crispin in early drama performances and getting into his early commercial work and sharing these incredible things that I assumed I would at one point be able to capture on camera with him. So again, that's why I think I probably don't have audio recording of this, although after we're finished here today, I'm going to deep dive into my archives to see what I can find. But it helped me flesh out my perspective on Crispin as a performer and a creative entity. And Crispin and Bruce had been working for many years at this point on a film together where Crispin plays the younger version of the character that Bruce plays, older, and they're traveling through time and kind of bumping into each other. You're going to hear a little bit of discussion about that in the conversation to follow here. As of today, which is July 1st of 2024, that movie has not yet been released, but I have been in touch with Crispin since. There was a moment where I was going to be bringing him into a film festival in the East and bringing this film to the audience for the very first time as a world premiere, but it wasn't ready at that time. That was last fall when that was to occur. So I expect this thing should be done very soon, but quite literally, it's been about 5 years in the making. And one of the key people involved with that is my frequent DP, Jim Coons, who has been on, countless special features over the years. Your shelves, whether you know it or not, are surely riddled with Jim Coons shoots. He's one of the mainstays and go-to folks in Los Angeles when it comes to these kinds of interviews. So it didn't end up becoming all that I wanted it to be. And then I had pitched Crispin on Willard, the release from Shout Factory, now Shout Studios, on a piece regarding his career, focusing on all of his work and his various relationships that also included Bruce. But Crispin at the time was in the middle of buying a castle overseas, and he didn't end up back in LA in enough time for me to be able to include him with that disc. So, we were both excited to have that conversation about Willard, and it's one of those heartbreaking things that to this day I look back on and think, damn, I really wish that we would have had the opportunity to connect for this Blu-ray, because I'm not sure how many other times he is going to have the opportunity to speak on the stories behind it. But we do touch on a lot of that here in the discussion that's to follow that ended up, as I mentioned, in Fangoria. So anyway, in terms of Reverend Entertainment news, the Natural Born Killers 4K Steelbook is going to land the day after this episode's streets, which is going to be on the Natural Born Killers front, July 2nd. And after that, on 8/13, is The Clash and Wrath of the Titans from Arrow Video. That's on 4K and Blu-ray as well. 8/20 is going to see the street date of Death to Smoochie, which I talked about a little bit more on the last episode, which is Danny DeVito's sort of tribute to noir cinema, dark humor, which he's an expert at, and I certainly hope you enjoy that one. Spiral lands from Ronin Flicks on September 10th, And then, as I spotlighted to some extent on the previous episode 30, Bringing Out the Dead on 4K and Blu-ray from Paramount, which lands 9/17. The pre-order link for that, there was some delay in that through Amazon, but it is now finally posted on my site and everywhere else. I'm going to throw it up on social media as well so everyone can finally get those orders in. I'm just so thrilled that this turned out the way that it did. And the interviews with Scorsese, with Cage, with Schrader, and then all of the on-set interviews, which have never been seen before in their totality, are available on that release. It really is kind of one of those moments where it's like, okay, if I, for some reason, disappear tomorrow, I have done all that I feel like I had hoped to do. It really is like this moment of sort of arrival where I am cemented in the history of a film that I love so much and am honored, beyond honored, to be part of this release. So, September 17th, Bringing Out the Dead, 4K and Blu-ray from Paramount, is part of the Paramount Presents series. Please visit justinbeam.com for the link for that and get that pre-order in. They are limited in number. The Paramount Presents series is always limited to a certain quantity, so it's important that you get your order in as early as you can to make sure that you're on that first wave, because it can be many months or maybe even years before a title is re-released. I remember this happening on Breakdown from Paramount, the Kurt Russell picture Breakdown, and I was so proud of it and just trumpeting it from the mountains. And all of a sudden, it was revealed that within about 2 days, that title was completely sold out. And I am pretty sure that's going to happen again here on Bringing Out the Dead, especially considering all the wonderful media coverage that we've had on this release. So please do click that link and get that pre-order in to make sure you have it for your collection. Although down the road, I am pretty sure it's going to enter the general catalog from Paramount, and I will, of course, post you on that as soon as that's the case, should this one sell out, which everyone expects it to. The best way to keep up with that kind of news is at justinbeam.com. You're going to see a little pop-up flash in front of you about joining the mailing list. That's something that I certainly don't abuse in any way. I just send you the latest news on title announcements, on special feature announcements, maybe once in a while on some sales on the site, but that's really about it. So please do sign up for that at justinbeam.com, and then you'll make sure to be on the front end of whatever the news is relating to Bringing Out the Dead or any other title. So, without further ado, let me get you into the conversation with Crispin Glover. This is a long haul, but definitely one worth seeing through to the very end. Thank you so much for listening, for giving the show a rating wherever you are listening to it, and for subscribing. It just means the world, whether it's on your podcast platform of choice or over on YouTube, where I am now uploading all of the archival episodes. And a quick note regarding archival episodes, one of the missing pieces from that history was episode 13 with director Ed Hunt, who made The Brain and Happy Birthday to Me. And I actually met Ed when I had been working on The Brain Blu-ray for Shout Factory, and we hit it off from the start. And that conversation is presented in full on episode 13, now back in the archives on your streaming platform of choice. Thank you for listening. I certainly hope you enjoy Crispin, and I will be talking to you on the other side of the interview. Right. Well, we'll just go ahead and dive in here and start with your early exposure to cinema. What were some of the your earliest memories of interest in film?
Well, it's funny. I was thinking about it recently. and I, I grew up, for the most part, not seeing a lot of films. I saw more television when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Very early memories at the same time. When I was born in New York. My father's an actor, and my mother retired as a dancer and actress when I was born. And we moved out to Los Angeles when I was 3.5 because my father was getting more work in film in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't. My father hadn't made very much money. In fact, my father really never made a huge amount of money as an actor. I grew up he definitely made enough. I grew up in a middle class, comfortable household, but not definitely not upper class either.
Mm-hmm.
So when we first moved out from Los Angeles, they had to save money, and we would go to the drive-in movie theater to see movies, and I would hide under a blanket in the back seat just because it was less expensive to get me in. We'd get a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, and some of the movies. One of the movies I definitely remember seeing was still one of my favorite films ever made was 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I definitely remember seeing it at the drive-in movie theater. It would have been, I guess, I have to look online. I think it came out in, 68 or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
So I probably saw it when I was 4 years old. Maybe it would have been a year later, I'm not sure. But I definitely remember seeing it at the drive-in movie theater in Los Angeles and liking it as well. I'm sure my understanding of it, of course, is a more sophisticated understanding than when I first saw it when I was a child. But I definitely liked it. Yeah, it came out in 68. It's possible we saw it in the drive-in as late as 69 or 70, but
sure.
I would have been 4 or 5 or 6. But I enjoyed it.
Were you a big reader as a kid?
I suppose in comparison to a lot of kids, I read more than some kids, but I wasn't overly that way. Things I remember reading were certainly school assignment books, which still are some of the books that I love. I read, of course, 1984, and a book that I really liked a lot, I would have been 13 or 14 when I read it, was Day of the Locust. That was a school assignment. I still think it's the finest book ever written about Los Angeles. And on my own, those were school assignment books, but I really liked them. I remember liking Lord of the Flies as a school assignment book.
Me too.
On my own as a kid, I read a fair amount of Ray Bradbury. I read a fair amount of Kurt Vonnegut on my own. But, and of course, when I was younger, I guess I read some other things. But those are things I had good experiences with as a kid.
So you were attracted to, even then, I mean, you're talking about Bradbury and Vonnegut, you're talking about some pretty heavy stuff. You were attracted to sci-fi and a little more fantasy type?
Whatever you want to consider. I read Ray Bradbury before I read Kurt Vonnegut, and I kind of remember that I read those right in a row of each other. Like I was reading like Ray Bradbury when I was like 11, 12, and then I was reading Kurt Vonnegut when I was like, I probably read Ray Bradbury 11, 12, 13, and then Kurt Vonnegut when I was like 15, 16.
Sure.
But I remember, definitely, I know the years that I read 1984. I was probably 12 when I read 1984, and I might have been 12 or 13 when I read Day of the Locusts. And I think the same year I read Lord of the Flies, because I kind of remember thinking I'm reading two insectine books in the same year.
Yeah.
Day of the and Lord of the Flies, and liking both of them a lot.
Yeah, Lord of the Flies was an interesting book for them to have in school. I've always felt. Were you raised in a religious household?
Not at all. In fact, if anything, I'm almost raised slightly anti-religiously. My father was raised Swedish Methodist, and as a in the 1930s, they really preached hell a lot. So as a kid, if you liked like going to movies or dancing with girls or things that he liked to do, and you're going to go to hell. So he grew up believing he was going to go to hell and definitely didn't want me to be raised that way. So I was raised with no religion whatsoever. But
Interesting.
That book was a part of a school assignment, and I went to a private school from first to ninth grade called Merman School, and it was not a religious school at all. It was you took a test to get into it, an IQ test, and so it was a school for gifted kids. It was a great school. I'm really glad I went there.
I always thought that Lord of the Flies presents childhood in a very, in an almost. I was raised Roman Catholic, where you're handed the weight of being a human being from the time that you're so young. When you're just, you're responsible for your own sins and for your own wrongdoings and all these things. And in Lord of the Flies, I remember the impact of a society of children acting like adults, where they're calling themselves into these roles that were so foreign to me as a child. What do you remember about your response to that book?
I loved the book. I remember just specifically having to do with what you were talking about, having to do with religion. I remember I had a really good English teacher in the year that we read that, named Stuart Beagle. He teaches. I think he teaches. I haven't looked. He either teaches law at UCLA now, or he teaches teaching at UCLA. But he's a great teacher. I haven't talked to him in a long time. But he, I remember him talking a little bit about some religious symbolism. The name of Simon. Simon was kind of the spiritual character. I actually even remember thinking a little bit. I didn't know if I bought the symbolism that he was talking about, but it may very well have been that the writer was specifically thinking about that. I'm not so sure. But I remember the teacher talking about it. And I don't mean to criticize him. He was a great teacher. He was definitely one of my teachers that I really started taking writing seriously, because he was teaching English but also creative writing. He's a really good teacher. He came up with good creative writing assignments that I liked a lot.
Did you do a lot of writing on your own as a kid?
Yeah, that I definitely did a lot. I definitely did a lot of that, and then that played into ending up making my own books. I used to, like in high school, I used to have those like Need spiral notebooks.
Oh yeah, sure.
And I would fill those up and write story after story. I wrote a lot of short stories at that time, but then the books. I started making the books when I was 19, and I had both been working with India Ink from when I was a kid and writing, and then those things ended up incorporating into each other kind of accidentally. I think I sent part of those written responses might have had something to do with it. I can't remember if I sent that part or not.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
So as a child, you were getting into television and film work at a young age. What do you remember? I'm sorry.
I didn't work in feature films or films at all until I was 18. When I was a kid, I actually didn't work that much as a kid either. I had decided it was I got an agent when I was 13, and it sounds a funny thing to say, but when you're 13, it's actually late to get into child acting.
Yeah.
Because most kids that have gotten into acting have been pushed into it by their parents at a young age, like 5 or 6. And I do think that can be very damaging. Now, the decision for me to go into the film industry or the acting was my own decision. I really was not pushed into it or even suggested to do it by my parents at all. I came up with it. It was around 11 or so that I started thinking about it, and then I became more vocal about it a bit later. And there was one of the kids in my class had an agent, Mary Grady Agency, and he was doing some commercials and stuff, and so I got my parents to contact the Mary Grady Agency, and that they're still one of the large. I think it's the largest child agency. So when I was first in the business, that was my agency, and it was something that I had wanted to do, and my parents were then supportive of it. But because of that, I really didn't work a lot. I did some things. I did some commercials. I did a little bit of television, and then it wasn't until I was 18 when I started really working a lot. Once the child labor laws started working in my favor.
Was there? You mentioned how kids getting pushed into the industry can be damaging. From you being there, even though 13 may be late to get into the game as a child actor, but it's still young to be in such an adult industry. Was it easy for you to see how these kids could fall into trouble with substance abuse and things like that? How were you treated?
Not really, because I didn't work a lot. Like I said, I only did I got a job. My first job I got was when I was 13, was for a Coca-Cola commercial. And I never get ill. I was really excited. I got this Coca-Cola commercial. I really wanted to do it, and I never got the stomach flu, never. And I woke up on the day of the commercial, and I had the stomach flu. I was really mad. I couldn't do it. I was really sick. Mm-hmm. So my actual first job that I did, I got from going to a cattle call at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion for the Sound of Music. And I got it from a cattle call. It was actually a very invigorating thing to go where there were literally like hundreds or thousands of people, kids, there to audition for this thing. And I went through, all of the cut downs all the way to getting the part. It was exciting. Wow. And I did have to, that was the last year I was at that private school, Merman School, and I had to, they were studying stuff about Russia, and so I missed some of that. I had to read a book called The Russians by Hedrick Smith, which was actually a really good book. But I had a tutor, and I missed a bit of school, but it was a valuable experience. So there was nothing negative for me about the experience at all. I was excited and wanted to be there. And then I got another show. I did a couple of other commercials in between that. And then when I was 16, I went on yet another cattle call. And it was something that was in Variety. My mother saw it. She pointed it out to me. And so I went in, again, hundreds, I don't know, maybe thousands, I can't remember. It ended up being a show called The Best of Times, a pilot, and I got it from this cattle call. So I was excited. I was 16, so I didn't work I didn't work a lot. I did maybe a couple more commercials, and then it wasn't really until I was 18 that I started working more. So I'd worked very little as a kid. So my experience when I was working was that of excitement. Mm-hmm. As an adult working in the film industry, I saw kids who'd obviously been pushed into it, and I could see that there were troubles. Those kids didn't really want to be there, and they were messed up. Not always, but I definitely saw it. I never experienced it for a second because, again, I didn't work a lot, and it was my decision. I wanted to be there, and I wanted to work a lot more. I saw all these kids that were working a lot because they were names. They were kids, they were names in terms of like child acting, and they would get the roles and I wouldn't because I wasn't really a child actor name. So I was always wanting to work, and then I was very happy when I started working a lot more.
In your answers to a few of the questions, you mentioned that, truth be told, you really do kind of shy away from the limelight, and the being center stage, things like that. What?
How do you mean? How did I put that? I don't.
Let me look and see here. I would say my personality type is not that of a standard actor's personality. That would be more of someone who enjoys attention. That, in fact, makes me rather uncomfortable. For me, yeah. So that being the case, I mean, being an actor, going into that it's a funny thing. I mean, what I realized was this. I told my parents around the age of 11 that I was interested in doing it. Mm-hmm. My personality type was a bit more shy, and my father was in a film called Walking Tall. Yep.
He was in all three of them, and these were made in the 70s. I had told my parents about this, and my father said, "Well, would you like to go in?" And on a meeting, it was a part for the son of the sheriff, Buford Pusser. I said, "Yeah, I'd go in." So I went in for the meeting, and I did not, I spoke with the casting person kind of in a shy fashion, like I wouldn't expand upon like questions. I would just kind of, if he asked a question, I'd smile and say yes or no. And it wasn't that, like in school, I was comfortable with my classmates. I had been in like school plays and stuff, and I was comfortable with being on stage. But I didn't realize, the school that I went to was relatively academic, and I didn't realize that you really needed to kind of put yourself forward as a personality. So after I had that meeting, the casting person said to my parents was I wasn't really like an actor type, that I was a bit shy. So, my parents said that, and I thought about it, and I realized, I see, if you're an actor, you have to kind of be somebody that talks and is invigorated and laughs or whatever. And so by the time, a couple of years later, when I went in for the meeting with the agency, Mary Grady, I knew that I had to kind of sell myself, so to speak. And I had a book that had photographs of me from school plays, and I went in and I was much more personable. So I developed the concept of how to be. So my nature really is not that of somebody that is like, I want to go out and have a whole bunch of attention brought on myself. But it was a clinical decision in some ways. I knew I could do it. I knew I could do it if I got behind the role, got behind I wouldn't have expressed it at that young of an age, but now I know if I get behind the idea of what the character is, I'm very comfortable with doing that. But if attention is just put on me in terms of something about just being me personally, I do still get a little bit uncomfortable with that. I mean, I'm okay with it. I'm not like, it's not something like I'm secretly dreading anything. I'm glad to be in the business that I do. I made a good decision at a young age, and I knew it was something that I could do, and I essentially was right that I could do it. And I'm very comfortable, especially with things like touring around with my films and shows that I do, because there are ideas and concepts behind them that I like a lot.
Yeah. This leads me to the next question, where it's actually more of a topic about sort of organic artistic output from people. And I'm especially interested in discussing this with you because of who you've chosen to populate, your films with. I used to work with developmentally disabled kids on an integration program in an elementary school years ago, where we would take them into standard classrooms. And it was just amazing. It's like being a parent and seeing a child who functions purely on instinct and love and intuition seeing them go into the world and use all the tools that are organic to them as opposed to tools that are commercial or worrying about how they look to their classmates and things like that. I was always fascinated by that, and I was curious what your thought is on putting someone in front of the camera like that.
Yeah, well, as you said, you've worked with people with developmental disabilities, and so you know that every person with a developmental disability is entirely different from another person with a developmental disability.
Right.
And some of the actors that I was working with were actually seasoned professionals. They were good at matching and like really knew what they were doing. And they were great. But I also knew into going into it, I had written it specifically to be working with people that may not be seasoned professionals. And really what's the most important thing, whether somebody has Down syndrome or not, is if they're enthusiastic. If somebody wants to be there and is excited about being there, they're going to do a great job, and they want to do a great job. And everybody that was in the film was exceedingly enthusiastic. So they were just, every single one of them were just great to work with. And they were all, they were right for their roles. You know, they no matter what they did, they couldn't go wrong, essentially, because I was also incorporating, when I could, organic elements into what they would bring into the performance. And, this isn't What Is It? Everything Is Fine is very different. Steve did not have a developmental disability, he had a physical disability. And that was, based on his screenplay. So that's a whole different kind of situation. But in What Is It, I would utilize the organic qualities, the so-called mistakes. What in art is always called the happy accidents, and they were, and they very much affected what the content and even structure of the film ended up being. Like I'll give an example. I usually don't like to talk about specifics because often people haven't seen the film. But there's one line in it that I had written for the protagonistic character to say was, don't interfere with my mission. The way the actor memorized it was, don't interfere with my mind. And when I heard him say it, I thought, that's a much more interesting line than what I'd written. And so I went with that, and that ended up being a big part of what happens within the film. So whenever I could, I would try to utilize those things to their benefits.
Do you think that you approach acting from an organic standpoint when you head into your roles?
I always attempt to, yes. I always aspire toward that. I mean, certainly when after a number of years, I've been acting professionally. It's been coming up lately. I've been doing a number of interviews. Let's see, it was 1978 when I started, unless it was 77, but we'll just say 78. So that would be, that's 33 years. And so certainly one comes to, even if you don't want to, there's certain kind of, you've been presented certain problems before that you've worked out the solution to how to handle those problems. One does not want to get stale, and one doesn't want to handle the solutions exactly the same way every time. But certainly there can be shortcuts because you've handled certain problems before that you had to take time to figure out earlier on. But as far as the psychology of the character, every character's psychology is unique. And to get to that point of utilizing your own psychological aspects that are similar to the characters and utilizing those portions, because no matter what you're playing, whether you're playing a grade A, valedictorian in a school or a crazy person, there's going to be a portion of your own psychology that can fit that character. Mm-hmm. and you want to utilize those portions for those characters. And it takes some figuring out as to what is right in your own psychology to fit those characters.
I was talking recently to John Cusack about, he played Edgar Allan Poe in a new film coming up called The Raven.
Okay.
And he was talking about having to get into the headspace of Poe where he was, because the film takes place in his final days. And then we got in this whole talk about darkness in art, darkness in the artist, and how so many artists seem to be drawn to, pushing themselves to extremes, living on the edge, to places of, and so many of the characters that you've played, well, many of them, especially since this is a genre magazine, referencing some of the darker characters like in Willard and Wizard of Gore. Do you think that all artists are drawn to darkness?
Well,
do you find yourself?
I've always had an interest in the unusual. You can call things dark. I feel like if you look at the balance of something, the classic phrase, "What is light without dark?" and vice versa, "What is dark without light?" They're balances. I do think good art has a dynamic that has ideally all qualities, meaning, one has to have light and dark, and I mean that sincerely. You can't just have dark. If it's just dark, it's not good, and the same way if you just have light, it's not good. There has to be a proper dynamic that balances, so you get an interesting totality. And I think good artists understand that there is a dynamic that incorporates both. And I think sometimes lesser artists will be afraid of one or the other. They'll be afraid of light or they'll be afraid of dark. And it's important to have all these things.
Why do you think so many artists, and not just in film, but in literature, in all sides, why do you think so many of them are so self-destructive?
I don't know that's necessarily true. It may be true, but I think if there was really a scientific study of how many artists were genuinely self-destructive versus, say, who knows what, I don't know, teachers or post office workers, I don't know. Mm-hmm. One may find that it's not as imbalanced as all that. I'm sure one can take a number of artists that are not what one would classically call self-destructive, but there certainly are, and probably those that are. There's probably been difficulty in their lives. I mean, it's such an individualized element as to like Beethoven. You think of Beethoven, and you don't really necessarily think of him as self-destructive, but I mean, I've studied a little bit about his life, and he had an alcoholic father, and he had to take care of his brothers and sisters, and he was definitely an angry person from all accounts that I've understood of him. But at the same time, he was incredibly productive, and it's not like he died that I know of any specific standardly claimed ideas of what's considered self-destructive. I think he'd had smallpox. I'm forgetting. I think he did, but that's probably what helped lead to his hearing problems. And of course, what an incredibly difficult situation for someone like that to be in. So you wouldn't really call that self-destructive, but he had difficulties.
Yeah. On I was speaking with Elias Merg about his film Begotten.
Yeah.
And Shadow of the Vampire, and he said that you actually were largely responsible for him getting Shadow of the Vampire as a film.
That's nice
What?
to be said that.
Is it true that you had passed a copy of Begotten off to Nick Cage?
Yeah, that's right. I knew that Nick was producing things, and I can't even remember specifically now if I'd read Shadow of the Vampire, or Nick was saying he was looking for a director, and I think I had recently seen The Begotten, which I liked very much, and I said that he should meet with that director. And I had been in contact with Elias, I think it's Merige. I can't remember how his last name's pronounced.
Yeah.
But in any case, I was in contact with him. I'd met with him or something, and I can't even remember how he and I initially were in contact. But it was just a coincidence of the time, and I knew that Nick was looking for somebody, so I introduced the two of them, and it happened. It worked out.
It's interesting that Begotten isn't a film that everyone knows, but it's a film that those who have experienced it had a very strong reaction and have really oftentimes embraced it. And it's such a unique picture. And it's talking to him, he hasn't found any reason since to do a whole lot. He did Shadow of the Vampire, which was very interesting, and then Suspect Zero, but he really made a point to credit you with passing that on. So that's interesting that you were so drawn to it.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I didn't know that he'd said that. That's great. That did happen. But it wasn't like that big of a deal. Like, he and I had met or talked. I can't remember even how. And I'm friends with Nick, and it was just a kind of a coincidence, really. And he's a solid director, so I'm glad it worked out. I'm glad to hear he said that. That's nice. There are things like that where you know that you have some kind of influence or something, but often people don't hear about it. So it was nice of him to say. That's great.
On to manipulation and motivation of the audience. This is something that I know you have some great thoughts on, and you've with your films and as well as live appearances, you've definitely been an active participant in this. This reminds me of like the Living Theater, Jim Morrison, and how he would push the audience to the edge just to take them somewhere uncomfortable. What's your theory on taking the audience out of their comfort zone and what that does for them and what it does for your art?
Well, there's a quote that's on the IMDb that something that I said probably in the 1980s, where I said something to the effect of something about the aesthetic of the art of discomfort, or the aesthetic of discomfort. Mm-hmm. And I understand what I was talking about. Yet I think I get asked about it a lot, so I know that people kind of see that, and they feel that it was like a mission statement or something that I'd made. But it is somewhat related to things having to do with my films. But it's I really, what is it specifically? Most of the actors in the film have Down syndrome, but the film is not about Down syndrome. What it really is my psychological reaction to the corporate constraints that have happened in the last 30 years, where anything that can possibly make an audience member uncomfortable is necessarily excised, or that film will not be corporately funded or distributed. And I think that's a very damaging thing, because it's that moment when an audience member sits back in their chair, looks up at the screen, and thinks to themselves, is this right what I'm watching? Is this wrong what I'm watching? Should I be here? Should the filmmaker have done this? What is it? And that's the title of the first film. What is it that's a taboo in the culture, and what does it mean when the taboo has been ubiquitously excised? And again, I think it's an extremely damaging thing to the culture, because it's those moments when people are asking questions that they're actually having an educational experience. And when that questioning element has been ubiquitously excised out of the culture in our filmic media, it's incredibly damaging, because really, what's the opposite of education but propaganda? And I think that is what's happening in our culture right now, and it's bad. It's bad for our culture. So it's related to that element that you're talking about. I don't mean to say that everything has to have discomfort, or that everything has to have taboo. Ultimately, a big part of the point of what is it is that the taboo is not what is important. Mm-hmm. What's important is that we are able to go beyond these kind of constraints. There's a universe of ideas that we could be going into, but because there are certain things that are considered taboos, we're not supposed to go into them in our corporate media. And that's really, really bad. We need to be able to go into other realms of thought. And that, unfortunately, is not happening, or when it does happen, it's so difficult, and there's so many restraints and constraints that there are these walls that are being put up of what we're able to communicate about in our corporately funded and distributed film media.
That's like with Begotten, hearing him talk about the response to that film. That's one that it disobeys all of the sort of generic constraints in standard, film, and especially in the U.S. And, he'd find it in the adult film section in some stores. He'd find it in the documentary section. It's just so misunderstood when it doesn't fit in so neatly into something that's sanitized. Do you think that horror cinema is a lot more likely to revel in taboo or celebrate things that are taboo?
Not necessarily. What I do think about the genre of horror, fantasy, and science fiction that's a positive. I'm not saying this is the norm. I'm not, I know I've been in a fair amount of horror, fantasy, science fiction, etc. But I don't really consider myself an aficionado, or necessarily even a fan specifically of that genre. But there are films of that genre that I love, and the reason that one of the great things that I think about when I'm lumping those genres in together is that they can serve as very strong metaphors for other things, and those metaphors can counter propaganda in a nice poetic fashion. What can also happen with metaphors is, of course, they can be metaphors for propaganda. So it's a dangerous thing in general when working with metaphor, and that's how usually propaganda and counter propaganda works. But it is the beauty of those genres in particular is you can, when somebody's killing a person, are they really killing a person, or are they killing an idea? Okay. And of course, when it's done without an artistic thought, then it just does become about somebody killing something. I know there's a lot of people that like just the gore factor, so to speak, or the splatter effect, or whatever you want to call it. But really good horror / psychological terror / the one genre I could say that I generally put What Is It and Everything Is Fine in I call them dramas with humor. I don't really like to categorize them, yet at the same time I could say that Everything Is Fine, It Is Fine, Everything Is Fine. It does fit in the realm of psychological terror, ultimately, if you want to call that a genre. Something like maybe Repulsion you would call psychological terror. Yeah. But there's, in Europe, they don't really call it, when they have those festivals, they don't really call them sci-fi, fantasy, or horror. They call it fantastic film. and with spelled with a Q-U-E, fantastique.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that genre because it, of course, goes into fantasy, and my own films definitely go into fantasy. Fantasy, surrealism, I do like those areas. And I feel like people that are fans of the horror / fantasy / science fiction genres also often are more cinephiles in general. They can be more educated about the various genres in film, including things like fantasy and surrealism. I find that sometimes people involved in those elements can be more open, but not always. Sometimes people that are involved in that kind of film can be very close off to that kind of thing. It depends.
Do you think that fantasy stems from how much? Well, I guess I should say, as children, so much of what we're driven by is fantasy and fear. It's like these two things, and it's interesting that you're talking about genre material basically being a hybrid of, involving so much fantasy, but also obviously it has an element of fear there. How do you think our concept and our understanding and attraction to fantasy and fear evolves from childhood into adulthood? As an artist looking at, approaching a character, is it in that moment where that character exists, or are you considering anything that would have come before?
Well, like when you're taught, basically the acting techniques that I taught from, I learned from or derived from Stanislavski and, Russian-based psychological understandings of the character. And certainly part of what you're taught is to understand why the character got to the point of where they are, what their childhood was like, and all of that sort of thing. And sometimes that's exceedingly important in a character you're playing. Sometimes some of those things are very evident. What I'm saying here, maybe there'd be certain acting teachers that would say, no, you always have to know exactly what happened in this person's childhood, no matter what. You have to know every single thing about that character, and it's not bad to know those things for sure. But sometimes you get a screenplay a week before you're playing your character, and you've got to make decisions, and you have to investigate the things that are pertinent to what is going to be illustrated for that character, so to speak. But you do have to know why that person is thinking the way that they're thinking, and often what their childhood was like and how they got to that point plays into that. So that stuff's important. Is that what you were asking, or did I misread your question?
No, when I asked it, I kind of went down two roads, so that's great. That actually does perfectly address the second half. The first is, I guess, and I could word it differently, would be that so many people come into genre-type material, like you watching 2001. Yeah. You're coming into that in your youth, and that's when you attach yourself to it, and you, so often, as I've found writing for these magazines for years and talking to fans as well as filmmakers, that it's something that they started loving very young. So there's a nostalgia that comes with it. There's a romance that builds with it over time. Do you think that our feelings about fear and fantasy change from when we're kids to when we're adults? Or do you think that we carry that with us as well?
I would assume so. I remember, I think I maybe this isn't what you're asking, but now we were talking about films. On television, I remember when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I tried to watch the original film, The Blob, from the 1950s. I was really young, like literally 4 or 5 years old, and I found the concept of that very frightening. This thing that would get on you and then slowly eat you, and I remember like I had to turn the television off when I was like 5 years old because it was scary. Of course I've seen this film now. That's the only film I actually remember where I ever had that experience with, where it was actually as a kid like a really frightening concept. And of course I've seen it now, and there's nothing frightening about the film at all. It's not a scary movie. But if you think about it, the real concept of what that is, of this kind of, gelatinous single-celled organism, basically, that will slowly ingest you. if that were reality, it really would be a horrifying thing. I guess you'd have to cut your arm off if it got on your arm, otherwise it would eat you.
Right.
So I remember it was the slow-moving element of it. I think by the end of the film it gets to be this fat. I can't remember. I haven't even seen that since I was a kid either. But I was an older kid when I saw it again.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's what you're talking about, but
yeah. And then heading in, and then as adults, people approach these films from a completely different standpoint. It becomes more of a lot of fans are really into the technical side then because they aren't scared anymore.
Maybe they want to dissect it. I mean, I think, like my own filmmaking, I'm not opposed to terror or tension, and I know that that's a cinematic. There's a kind of an excellence that can happen from an excellent filmmaker that gets into those tensions. I don't feel personally like that's what my speciality as a filmmaker is. I'm not against it, and maybe I'll discover that I get into that at some point. For whatever reason, I'm slightly into something other than that, but I think there are filmmakers that are very calculating as to how to employ tension. Like you see Alfred Hitchcock talking about it. There's some interviews that you can look on YouTube of him talking about a mistake he'd made early as a filmmaker where I think a bomb, how did he put it?
Oh, yeah, I've heard that story where the audience knows the bomb is under the table.
Well, in his earlier film, the audience didn't know, and then the bomb is found, or he didn't have the audience being concerned about what was going to happen to the bomb. And then he discovered, of course, that it was important to have the audience know about something that was going to happen, and then tension would build. So, I mean, those things, of course, are important, and there are filmmakers that definitely scrutinize that very aspect, and it is good when it happens. I mean, I enjoyed it as an audience member. For whatever reason, as a filmmaker, I have not necessarily gotten into that as much, and maybe I should get into it more than I have. But it isn't what I find myself thinking about most.
Yeah.
But I enjoy it when I watch it, so maybe I should think about it more than I do.
You're looking at the number of films that you've done that would be considered sort of at least genre related. The first big one for you that introduced a lot of horror fans to you, even if they had, for many before Back to the Future, would have been Friday the 13th, the final chapter.
Right. Yeah.
And going into that experience, looking at what came before it, what was it like heading out of television, out of the sort of more standard. I'm sorry.
Well, here's precisely what happened for me. The film that I made before that was a short film at the American Film Institute called The Orkley Kid. It's just a 35-minute film. It's still one of my favorite films that I've ever done. It was based on a real person, and it really is a very well-made film.
It's great. I watched it on YouTube. Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, I was 19 when that film was made, and I made Friday the 13th about 6 months after I made The Orkley Kid. I had moved out of my parents' house when I was 18. I had a little bit of money saved up from what I had made up to that point, but I had not worked. I didn't make any money when I did The Orkley Kid. I did that for free. I had some kind of contract, a Screen Actors Guild contract, which made it so I didn't get paid. And I hadn't worked for, I don't know, about 8 months or so for any paid job. And I paid for acting class, and I was running out of money. And I was getting really very concerned. Like, I didn't want to move back to my parents. I wanted to be out on my own. And I actually, at that point in time, I was in acting class, and there was an improvisational technique called the circle of death, where the teacher would clap their hands, and you would have to kind of go in the center and enact a death. And one time he changed to the circle of suicide. And there was a suicide thing that I did that actually I thought had a certain potential for comedy. So I was considering at the time, because I hadn't made any money, that I should maybe form some kind of routine, like a stand-up comedy routine, that involved this kind of suicidal element that I had done in this acting class. But what I'm saying is I needed to work very much. And I was very nervous because I had not gotten work for a while, and then I got this role in Friday the 13th. I actually, I had just done The Orkley Kid, which was a really strong psychological study of this character I was playing. So being in Friday the 13th was not exactly the highest artistic ideal. And I was thinking, well, it will be funny in the future that I was in this movie. And then I remember actually when I first started shooting it, I was very concerned. Like, I thought, oh, what have I done? And why am I doing this? I did not, I think I had actually. I've never seen any of those Halloween movies. I know the first one is probably a good film. I've never seen it. I had seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original one, and I did see the original Friday the 13th film. But it wasn't something I remember when I saw Friday the 13th in the movie theater. I saw it when it first came out. I had already seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Tobe Hooper version, and I thought, well, this film is extremely derivative of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I didn't think it was very good. I thought, and I'm talking about the original Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
I thought it was very obvious that it was derived from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I did think was a good film. I like that film. So, by the time Friday the 13th Part 4, I mean, it's funny now because it has become this kind of, I don't know what you call it, a genre, a beloved genre element. People really, they made that big, nice book of it, and people come up at shows and they have me sign the book. Which when I have my shows, I don't force people to buy my books after the show, and I'll sign other things. So sometimes the things that I'm signing are, people will definitely come by with that big, nice. It's a nicely made book. But I know people are really into that series of films. So I mean, I'm assuming that some of those people are the people that read Fangoria. I don't mean to, I know people can get upset about that. Like, if you say like something not 100% positive about this thing that they love. But I mean, whatever. I'm very glad I'm in the film now. It's a part of my career, but I was actually concerned. I mean, I went with it. I went and I did a good job and was glad to be there. I was glad to be making money working.
Yeah. What really concerned you when you got there? Was it the scope of things, or?
No, I knew it before I knew what the genre was. It's a limited genre for an actor. What is there? You're playing a character that essentially the way the structure of those films is they're teenagers or young adults that go to some secluded place and they have sex and then they get killed. So it's not like there's what can you do with that, really? You're not like a character that's after. I mean, everybody can relate to somebody that's young and is looking to find a girlfriend or whatever, but it's not like a strong psychological study, which is probably what I was more interested in doing. But whatever, I was very glad to do it. I'm glad I'm in it. I was playing this teenager that wanted to have sex, basically. Which, at that age, that's what my tutor was, which I had done like a year or so before that. There are a lot of those kind of teen hijinks movies in the 80s, of course, hijinks being more of a comedy, and then the Friday the 13th being these horror films. But they're essentially somewhat similar in terms of intention of what the characters want.
Yeah. And the series is full of just faceless, body count characters, essentially.
I've only seen the one that I was in and the original one.
Yeah.
I've never seen any of the others.
You have really stood out from all the films. I mean, I think now they're on number 11 or 12 or something like that. That out of all of them, your character and your performance keeps on coming up because there was something very different about that. And that's why Part 4 is such a fan favorite, because I think it goes places that the other films don't. It takes the time to establish your insecurities, for example. It doesn't just show you're not just. You know how so many of these films, and you're talking about the sort of teen, sex comedies and things. There's the stereotypical nerd. There's the jock who bullies the nerd and all of that. But this didn't play by those rules so closely.
Okay. Do the other ones? I don't remember even what happened in the original one very much. Of course, you mainly think about the main character, the character that kills people, Jason. And there's some kind of psychological study of that. All the rest of the characters are these peripheral elements. So I don't recollect. I know Kevin Bacon's in it, but I don't recollect all of the specifics of the if there were these kind of genre types that you're describing or not. And actually, I don't even remember it very well in the one that I did. I mean, I know what character I played, and I know I had the characters I interacted with, but I don't remember all of the nuances of all of the characters. I haven't seen it since it came out. So. Sure.
The film also was kind of famous in the series for its effects work. That was.
Yeah, I was familiar with Tom Savini because I had liked both. I had liked Dawn of the Dead, and I probably I'd read Fangoria at that time, so I'd looked at I liked the makeup effects, and I knew who Tom Savini was, and I was glad to be working with him because I knew he was a good special effects makeup person, and I had liked specifically the special effects in Dawn of the Dead, which of course he's in, and he did the special effects for. So
right.
I did know that, and I knew he was doing the special effects, and I was glad to work with him. And he was good. He is good special effects guy. Makeup.
You had one of the most memorable scenes in it with with the way your character is dealt with the corkscrew, and then of course then the effects that went into that and the preparation for those two sequences. Do you remember much about dealing with that? It
was actually a really simple thing. The hatchet that goes into my face. It was funny. I had to act backwards, so the hatchet was just cut out to match my face, facial features, and that was attached to my face with some kind of mild glue, and maybe the actor who played Jason held it onto my face. No, let me think about it for a second. Yeah, the shot started with it in my face. I can't remember if he had my hand. I would assume that it was glued onto my face in some fashion, and then he reached in, grabbed it, and pulled it out. And then I had to act in reverse, as though I was going to see the hatchet come into me, and then of course I'm dead. So I act dead, and then they pulled the hatchet out, and I look and see the hatchet. So that's how that was done. And then they definitely had one that was glued onto my face that had a small syringe that would just pump blood out.
Yeah.
It wasn't really complex technology, but it was more cinematic. Actually, it was effective because of the cinematic elements. And I like in What Is It, I use a lot of backwards film. One wouldn't even notice it, but there's a huge amount of backwards technique. Maybe it's even influenced from that. I don't know, but it's backwards shooting can be very effective for a lot of things.
How did you put it to use best?
Well, in What Is It, I fly in. I fly into a chair, kind of a big throne-like thing. So I had two pieces, two effects, because I didn't want to just drop in straight onto this kind of throne thing. Mm-hmm. So the pulley that had the wire on it that I flew in, essentially, it would mean that I had to, if I were just dropped into it in a forwards motion, the camera, it would work if I was right above the throne. But I wanted to come in on a diagonal so it looked more like I was floating in. So essentially it was shot backwards because the pulley was way over to the side. There would be more advanced techniques of using wire work. It was pretty simple wire work, but essentially it pulled me off of the throne over to the side, and so I had to act backwards as though I'd landed into the throne.
I see. Okay.
And it worked well. It looks good in the film.
I wanted to talk to you just briefly about Orkley Kid, because it is such a strong performance, especially considering your age at the time, and I love the turnaround for the character and the final moments of the very personal moment where he's contemplating suicide with the gun. Actually, I mean, it's such an intense moment there.
Yeah,
and then
it's good. Yeah,
and then the turnaround in the end and embracing, coming out in the end for the right reason, saying, I'm going to be true to myself, so the rest of you, with that character for you, was that a defining moment for you in terms of your concept of what did it do for you as an actor? In other words, it clearly would have been asking things of you that you probably hadn't dealt with in acting before.
Yeah. Well, I was still in acting class right at the time. I was in the same school that Sean Penn had gone to. Sean Penn had done the first. He had done, at the AFI, the directors are given a first year and a second year. They can either be invited back for the second year or not. And the filmmaker, at that time, I don't know if it's still similar, but at that time, the first year they did their. Probably different now with the technology is changing, but in 1983, or when we made that, the first year was shot on video, which Sean Penn had done the first year version, and he was supposed to come back and do the second year, but then he was working a lot. He didn't end up doing it. I actually initially came in, and it had to do with that I was at the Loft Studio. Somebody that had worked on the film suggested for me to come in. She was at Loft Studio, so I came in for an audition, not for the part that I ended up playing, because Sean Penn was supposed to play the part, and I came in to play the friend, Meryl, and but then Sean Penn, I wasn't going to. I came in for the audition, but I wasn't going to be cast in it. And for various reasons, the director didn't think it would be right if I played that part. But then when Sean Penn ended up not doing it, the director, I think actually Sean Penn had said something about me to the director, and the director had remembered me as well. And so I went in for the audition, and then I got that part. And I had seen both the original documentary that the character was based on, and I had seen how Sean Penn had played the role. And I'd like Sean Penn's. I still like Sean Penn's acting very much. And so there were things that I saw about the character that I could bring in from the original fellow, and I'm sure there were things that Sean Penn did that had influence. For example, the director wanted me when I was on set to stay in the mode of the character, because this was something that Sean Penn had done. Usually directors don't ask you to do that, and I don't do that because I find it distracting if I would be enforcing something other than, what people are kind of talking about. To me, the most important thing is concentration on a character, for getting to the psychology of it. And if the director wants it and the whole production is about the actors staying in character and it supports it, I think that's a very good way to work. But I think it can be distracting if it's not about that, and then, it's like you kind of want to deal with people on a level where they're not going to be like weirded out by what you're doing. So that I would find more. But it was it was a well-written piece, and it was based on an interesting person that a documentary had been made. So there's a lot of good stuff, and I was coming out of a good acting school, and it was all things positive about it.
You're finding the intensity in that scene alone with the suicide right there, and going back to you talking about the suicide circle, and going to that place we talked earlier about finding the darkness in that. There's so much truth in your face and in your eyes and your sweat in that moment where you're sitting there with that gun. That it seems as though that moment was doing something for you outside of just serving the role.
What's funny is that we were talking about Friday the 13th. That scene actually was shot in two sequences. There's the part where I put the gun in my mouth. I put the rifle in my mouth. That was shot before shooting Friday the 13th. The director was editing the film for maybe 8 months, a year. I think, in fact, I might have done two films. I think I did Friday the 13th, and then I did Teachers. I can't remember. We definitely did a reshoot, though. But it's after I have the gun, then there's a cut to a poster of the Olivia Newton-John, and then it comes back to me, and I'm kind of reacting to just having taken the gun out of my mouth. That was shot absolutely for sure after I did Friday the 13th. We came back just to do that. That was the only reshoot, I think. There might have been some other small little like hands reshoots or something. But so the director wanted a specific reaction that he didn't have. I think it was kind of a release that wasn't in the initial, when we initially shot it, or some decision that he didn't have in the original footage. So, it might seem very much like it was something specific or personal for me, which is good. I'm glad it comes off like that. But at the same time, technically, it was manipulated, and the director did a good job with that movie. So he was trying to get specific things as well.
The version that I watched had the sound way out of sync. Has it ever been made commercially available in any collections or in any kind of format?
Unfortunately not. I mean, I don't really like to... There's an unfortunate thing that happened with I made two films with that director. One's The Orkley Kid, which I really like, and then the other one's called The Reuben and Ed. And not to put a bunch of blame on things, there unfortunately are a lot of bootleg situations going on with the film, and what's happened because of that is I talked to Sony. It was a few years back now, but there, there's a lot of interest in Ruben and Ed as well, and Sony owns the rights to Ruben and Ed. But both Ruben and Ed and the Orkley Kid, it's the same writer-director, the demand has been lessened because bootlegs are going out of it. Sony told me they would be interested in putting Orkley Kid out on a non-demand, I don't mean Orkley Kid, I mean Ruben and Ed out on a non-demand basis. But I know what's happened is that because the bootlegs have essentially served the interest, the financial interest of people that would pay for it, there hasn't been a proper negative. Really what should happen for both of those films is the negatives should be put into a proper digital format and then, color corrected. And I would like to see the Orkley Kid and Ruben and Ed put together on a proper DVD. Also, though, the director put, I had seen he's put the three films together: the Orkley Kid, the one I did, the original documentary, and the version that Sean Penn did, which I think is called The Beaver Kid. And he re-released that as something called the Beaver Trilogy, which it's not really what the original. I don't really want to be saying negative things because I like all three of those films. I like the original documentary. I like the version of Sean Penn did, and I like the version I did. But it's not. There is a business element that has to do with contracts.
Hey, Crispin, I can hardly hear you at the moment for some reason.
Is this better?
Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you.
There are business elements done at the American Film Institute, contracts that they were not really stuck with. And on some level, I don't really care because I like all of those films. But what's unfortunately happened because of it is that it's put it into this kind of gray area legally, and I'm talking about for the filmmaker himself, so that he can't really distribute it properly legally. What I would like to see happen is I would like for the Orkley Kid and Ruben and Ed to be put out on a single DVD with it properly remastered, and like a commentary with myself and the filmmaker. But I think the filmmaker, it's too bad because he did a good job with those films, but I think financially and business-wise, he's found it better, unfortunately, to be doing it this other way, which I don't think is serving either him or the films. And so it's never been put out properly.
I really hope that happens at some point. It's too bad when things like this, gems like this, get lost in that sort of mire of legalese and all of that.
Yeah, it is difficult, but see, unfortunately, part of it has to do with the filmmaker, because he's doing things that are not serving what would serve the films in the long run.
Yeah.
And I don't really want to talk about it in print because
that's fine.
Because what he's doing isn't what I look the other direction, but I know what's happening because of it is that the films are not able to be properly remastered, and they really should. And I tried to have a conversation with the director about it one time, and he wasn't happy about the conversation, and I don't think he realizes the damage that he's doing to the project himself.
Yeah.
It's like I have, unfortunately, as much as I like The Earthly Kid and I'd like to see it out and all of this stuff, I have my own films that it takes my whole life to get stuff done and distribute. I tour with the films, and it's not really my business, so to speak, to be worried about another filmmaker's films. As much as I like the film and I'd like people to see it, essentially, unfortunately, probably the best way for people to see it is on these, unmastered ways, like seeing it on YouTube and that kind of
thing. Yeah.
I didn't even know. Are you saying that The Earthly Kid is up on YouTube and it's not sunk up properly? Is that right?
That's correct. All the audio, it's actually off quite a bit.
Yeah.
So it's not as subtle. And this is the victim of years and generations of bootleg on top of bootleg, where and so many films fall prey to this.
Yeah.
And it's just such a shame. But to at least be able to see it, and I mean to be able to experience it is a treat. And I'm glad it's at least out there in some form, like you said.
Yeah. It's too bad. I would like to see it properly remastered, and I just feel like probably what would have to happen is I don't know. It's just it's not really. Like I say, it's too much stuff that for me to have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely understood. Sure.
Yeah.
So, and cut me off at any point here. I appreciate all the time that you're taking with me, really do. Moving on to a film that was so embraced and really took things to a completely different place for you, River's Edge. Your role as Lane in River's Edge obviously would have been very different than your experience with Friday the 13th. I mean, the cast.
Sometimes people think that I did River's Edge before I did Back to the Future. But the fact is the next film I did after Friday the 13th was a film called Teachers. And then after Teachers, I did Back to the Future. And then after Back to the Future, I did River's Edge.
Yeah. I was for the sake of the article, I didn't want to spend too much time because I know you've been asked about Back to the Future ad nauseum over the years,
right.
And I just wanted touching on River's Edge, but I really wanted to get into also discussing your working with Jim Jarmusch on Dead Man, on Willard in specific. I mean, such an amazing film, and then Simon Says and Wizard of Gore. Those are the ones I really wanted to touch on. But River's Edge as a transition piece for you, coming out of something like Teachers, like Back to the Future, and then going into such dark, very realistic, gritty territory with River's Edge.
Yeah, well, I liked River's Edge. After Back to the Future came out and made so much money, I felt a certain obligation towards finding material that somehow psychologically reflected what my interests were. And the first film that I acted in after Back to the Future had come out was River's Edge. And I do like that film. I think it was a well-written screenplay, and Tim Hunter was a really good director, and he cast the film well. And it's a film. It's one of the films, the corporately funded and distributed films that I'm in, that I'm genuinely proud of. I like that movie a lot.
What was different about the experience on that for you? And did you feel more comfortable stepping into shoes like Lane than maybe George McFly?
Well, I was comfortable doing both of those films in certain. I had questions about a moral that was in Back to the Future, which ultimately ended up leading me not to being in the sequel. And what it was specifically, when I auditioned for that part, I was going to that school, that same loft studio where I had been when I did The Earthly Kid as well. Mm-hmm. What was great about that school was one of the things they had was you could go sign up for an empty room, and in the neutral territory go in with your scene partner and go over scenes. I had the audition for Back to the Future, And I had already come to know at that point that if you had an audition with an actor that you'd not met before the actual time that you went in for the meeting, there's kind of an energetic time where you need to get into an energetic working relationship by going over the scenes. So I had the sides. All I had for the film were the sides. The producers of the film did not want to give out the entire screenplay, which is relatively normal. You get your sides and you go in and audition.
Sure.
But I got a hold of the actor who I was going to audition with through his agents, and we went into the Loft studio, and I signed up and just went over these scenes in this neutral territory. It was really good. And then we went in the next day and auditioned and with the scene, and then they called it, this was for Robert Zemeckis. I'm not sure who else was in the room, but I know Robert Zemeckis was there, probably Bob Gale. And then they called in Steven Spielberg, and he watched it one time, and they looked at it and he said, I laughed. And then I got a call from my agents, on a message. I was in that acting class, I remember, on the pay telephone, and talking to my agents, calling them back, and that I'd gotten this part. But I had not read the screenplay. I didn't know what the role was. There's stuff up on YouTube now that says I'm in old age makeup, that it's the screen test for the film, but that's not accurate as to what it is. What is up on YouTube is a makeup test that we did after I had already gotten the role. When I got the role, I had not read the entire screenplay, and I said to my agents when I was on the phone, he said, yeah, you got this part. And I said, well, there was this other part, the part of the character the other character that I read with, would it make sense for me to go in and read for that character? And he said, no, you don't know. You don't understand. This part that you're going to play, you're actually going to play the older characters as well. And I said, wow, that sounds amazing. That's fantastic. That's great. Yeah, well, I don't want to go in for this other thing. I just want to go in for this, and this sounds like a great part.
Yeah.
So I did not read the screenplay until I was already set in the part. And, I hadn't, even though I acted a little bit, I hadn't acted in a lot of feature films about. I think it was my fourth or fifth feature film. Mm-hmm. And I'd come from a background of improvisational acting in my school and working on characters and having ideas and thoughts about things and having an open dialogue about it. And when I read the screenplay, there's something in it that Back to the Future was changed. There are certain aspects of the screenplay that are different from what are in the film now, and specifically about the end of the film. And there was something in it that, I won't go into the details of it, but there was something in it that would, for the most part, be very evidently, especially at this point in time, be considered a negative thing that our characters had when we came back to the alternate future and had money. And I said something about it, and I'm sure I wasn't the only person that said something about it, because this negative thing was changed. But I didn't just stop at that one thing. I felt that it was a bad message for the characters to come back having the reward of money. I felt that what should happen is that the characters should be in love. But as soon as the element of having money came into play, it gave a bad message. And I was vocal about it. And Robert Zemeckis got very angry at me. And he said, Chris, well, maybe I won't go into all these details, but ultimately, these things ended up, it's part of what ended up me not being in the sequels to these films, but to that film. But it's frustrating because, of course, there was a lawsuit, they put a false nose, chin, and cheekbone on another actor and interspliced footage of me from the original film in order to fool audiences into believing I was in it. And because of my lawsuit, there are people that, there are laws in the Screen Actors Guild that make it so actors and directors and producers can never do that kind of thing again. So I'm proud of the lawsuit for that. But because of that, there have been negative things that have been said, specifically by Bob Gale, who is the writer and co-producer that was one of the prime architects of this illegal situation. And he's been saying things that aren't true about me on the DVD because he wants to justify for doing this illegal action. And he's saying that I asked for the money that Michael J. Fox asked for, which is totally, it's totally false. And I mean, especially when I'm describing to you in detail of where my mindset is and where I was coming from, it has nothing to do with where you were talking about psychology of why does somebody get to where somebody is. Yeah. And he's basically trying to paint me as this like greedy, crazy guy, and he can say I'm a crazy guy because I've done these things in media and I've played these kinds of characters. But as far as greed, I mean, nothing that I've done in any of my career before or since being in Back to the Future has anything to do with greed. Whereas the message of the original film, what I had question about precisely had to do with that element. It had to do with greed. And the reason that he's made this up is so that it will make people not think about this illegal thing that they did. And frankly, well, I won't go into so many details, but it was a wrong thing for them to do, and they shouldn't have done it. And to continue to make more lies is even more wrong. And it's about one person, and that person's Bob Gale. I've been talking about it now recently because it's become increasingly clear to me that he's been saying these things on these DVDs, and recently. It's not old, it's new, and I really don't like it. And I've investigated things about the legality of what he's saying, and essentially people can make things up about you. What you'd have to do is to go and prove that you lost a specific job because of it if you're going to do a lawsuit about it. So I can't do a lawsuit about it, but I've got to set the record straight and let it be known that the reason this person's making it up is because they don't really want to answer to the fact that they did this illegal thing. Yeah.
Wow. I was familiar with the story of the lawsuit with the sequels and the makeup on the actor and all of that, and what a great thing that ended up actually turning into for all actors as a result. But I wasn't aware that he was still going at it.
Yeah, he's still making. He specifically, nobody else is. He specifically is saying things because I can tell what happened is. If you look at the IMDb, after our conversation, go and look at what happened after my lawsuit. The year that my lawsuit happened, I'm forgetting the exact year, well, you can mark it with where Bob Gale stopped writing screenplays, essentially. I don't know, it could be complete coincidence, but it's the year that the lawsuit happened. I read some article where Steven Spielberg brought up all of these Bob Gale screenplays, and it was Bob Gale being interviewed, and he was kind of proud of the fact that Spielberg had brought up all these screenplays. Spielberg was one of the people named in the lawsuit. Spielberg didn't have really much of an active role in what happened. Bob Gale did. Spielberg is not used to being in a situation where he's done something, especially something that's not legal. Yeah. The person that was the architect of that illegal action was Bob Gale. I mean, you can say it was Robert Zemeckis as well, but I mean, I have better feelings about Robert Zemeckis because I've worked with him again. I had a very positive experience working with him on Beowulf. Mm-hmm. Bob Gale stopped essentially working as a screenwriter at that point in time. He did end up directing one film in the early 2000s, but he stopped working. And I have a feeling psychologically he knows that Spielberg bought up those screenplays and he sat on them. And he doesn't, I think on some level Bob Gale somehow psychologically blames me, even though it's his own doing. He was the person that was involved in the negotiations for the sequel to Back to the Future, and he's the one who didn't really want me in the movie, essentially.
And you were never even approached for the films, right?
No, I was.
You were?
I was approached for them, but what they did was they offered me less than half of what Leah Thompson and Tom Wilson were making, which just wasn't right, and my agents didn't think it was right.
Mm-hmm.
And they stopped, which is specifically, again, I would not normally talk about this stuff, but because Bob Gale has claimed that I was asking what Michael J. Fox was getting, I have to go into these unfortunate details. I believe what Michael J. Fox was getting was something like $2.5 million, but I'm not sure of that. My negotiations had nothing to do with that. Ever, one point, never a sentence, word, iota of anything had anything to do with it. What conversations I did have, or specifically my agents had, was, and it was specifically with Bob Gale, was that it would be fair for me to be paid along the lines of what Tom Wilson and Leah Thompson were getting. Which what they had offered me was $150,000 for the sequel. The screenplay was written as one very long, big screenplay. It was much too long. I could tell they were going to cut it into 2 films. Mm-hmm. So they'd offered me $150,000 for that, and Leah Thompson and Tom Wilson were each getting, well, Leah Thompson in particular was getting way more than double, and Tom Wilson was getting more than double. So it didn't make any sense. It was apparent that they didn't really want me in the film, and if they were going to put me in the film, that we had to have some kind of humiliation involved. Like, if you think about it, if you look at the character, if the character's hung upside down for some idea that the character has a back problem. When I read the screenplay, it was written like that. I could tell that the reason they did that wasn't because it made any sense. Like, why would a character be hung upside down if he had a back problem? Yeah. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
The reason they did it was because they wanted to bother me specifically. And they wanted to bother me both in a physical discomfort and then the financial discomfort by offering me less than half of what my fellow, people that were playing similar sized roles as myself, which just wasn't right. Then when they finally did split it into 2 different films, they came back and they said they would make it $125,000. They went down. And when they knew that the $150,000 was less than half of what my fellow actors that were returning for similar sized roles were getting. Yeah. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an active, aggressive act. They had come up with the concept that they were going to put another actor into these prosthetics to make them look like me. They didn't want me there because I had asked questions. I'm talking about these kinds of questions that I'm interested in. Essentially, what is it has a reaction to this element in itself. I questioned too much when I was 20 years old. I was naive. I didn't know, but they got really, really pissed, and that is ultimately what happened. Like I say, Bob Gale goes into great lengths at this point in time to make it seem justifiable to have done something illegal. I mean, no, what could I have done? Even if I had done something like he's claiming that I did, which I didn't, but if I had, does that justify doing something illegal like that? Stealing somebody's face? Right. It's wrong. And instead of saying, well, we did something wrong, we shouldn't have done it. No, he goes into all of these things at great lengths, and now I feel like I have to defend it and say, look, not only did they do something wrong by doing something illegal in the first place, they're exacerbating, or specifically he, because Robert Zemeckis doesn't really say anything if you listen closely. Mm-hmm. Bob Gale is the one that does the talking about that, and he's the one that's making these things up, and he's the one that was most negatively affected by it. So he has motive for it. But in any case, the reason that I started talking about this was because you said, was it more comfortable for me to act in River's Edge than Back to the Future? These, other than that moral element, the moral that I had a question about, I had a good time playing the character George McFly. I liked the character. I got to play essentially 3 different psychological elements.
Yeah.
So, I feel good about the character. I enjoyed working with Robert Zemeckis. Even though we had those strong discussions, it's subsequent to what happened that was unfortunate. But then again, I had a very positive working relationship with Robert Zemeckis when filming Beowulf, and I actually did like the moral aspects of Beowulf, which had stuff to do with lies, and lies are not a good thing, and Beowulf very much has to do with that. So I feel positive about, if Back to the Future had never had any of those subsequent elements, I would feel very positive about it, even if I have questions about that moral aspect and what I feel like ultimately would make it would still be an incredibly popular film, and I think it would be a strong value if the characters had come back and they were in love with each other, with the potential that they would have money instead of the young character, the son character, jumping up excited that he's got this new truck in his garage.
Yeah.
But in terms of then working on River's Edge, I was very happy to play that character, and the script was an excellent script, and I did get to read the screenplay before I accepted it. That's something I would never do again. I would never not read a screenplay. I didn't know when I was 20 to not have done that. And of course, there are people that there's many people that love Back to the Future, and I've been hesitant to talk about these things because there'll be people that, of course, say, what kind of crazy person would be asking questions about something as great as Back to the Future? And I know even if you print this stuff in an article, which I'd be happy for you to do, that I'm talking about, there'll be people that react that way. But I hold that what I was questioning is valid, and I still think the film, if it had all of the things that it has in it, and the only thing is just that the characters came back and they were in love with each other, Lorraine and George were in love with each other, and there was the potential that money was going to come in, I think it would have a better moral to the final story in the whole. But just to have that question and to have that discussion and then to be reprimanded for it in the way that I've been reprimanded for it doesn't seem quite right.
Yeah, it's outrageous that they came at you that way. And I totally agree that a huge part of the charm of Back to the Future is that you want them so badly to get together. You want this to work out, and it's building toward that. And then for them to return in the sequels, the characters feel completely different for a number of reasons. But greed doesn't seem like it ever should have been a part of what these people were about, because you came to fall in love with the purity of the characters when he went back in time. And so I love that approach, the idea of them coming back with romance as opposed to greed. I think would have done so many things for it. Well,
I think so, and yet, of course, at the same time, it's a very popular film and well-loved film as it is. So, on some level, who am I to say? And yet, on the other level, the thing that I feel like is, well, I was 20 years old, I did say it, and I still agree with it, and the amount of negative retribution I've had specifically from Bob Gale, it seems wrong. It seems extreme.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so that must have really informed much for you down the road in terms of your decisions in going into projects and things. Do you feel like it helped further your resolve to explore independent films? Like I'm leading into Dead Man, for example.
Well,
working.
I mean, also though, some of it is self decided, but some of it also is when you have a lawsuit, of course, and you're not in the sequel to a very large film like that, then people question you as well. Like, well, what is this person crazy? Is there something wrong with, even though what I did was right, and I knew that when I was going into the lawsuit, I knew that these are questions that would happen. But I also felt like I had to stand up for that situation. That it was just so egregiously wrong what had happened that it wouldn't have been right for the future of, I don't know, fellow actors to not do that. And really what my primary element, what I was thinking about, had to do with neither. I just, at that point in time, people really believed I was in the movie. And people still believe that. And
Yeah.
I just wanted to get the word out. But that wasn't me, because I wouldn't have played the character the way that actor played the character.
Yeah. Oh, that's got to be so.
There's no question. It is the by far the most unpleasant thing I've dealt with, which is unfortunate because, of course, the original film, was a positive thing for me.
Yeah.
But the subsequent conversations I have to have about it, because of all of these elements, is I can't have a simple conversation because there are complexities. It's not a simple yes or no answer.
Right. And now it's, as an artist, so often as a director or even as a writer, you create something and then you hand it off and then it's out of your hands. And
and I'm okay with that. That part I'm okay with.
Yeah.
And of course, had back to the another thing that I'm quite certain comes from Bob Gale or other people that wanted to, involved in the production, that wanted to lessen what they had done. What is often written about my lawsuit is that it is about the reuse of original material of me in the film. That's absolutely inaccurate. If all they had done was reuse the footage of me from the original film, and they had not employed a different actor and put prosthetics to make that actor look like me, if all they had done was taken original footage of me from the original film and put it into the sequel, there would have been no problem, nothing whatsoever, and there would have been no legal situation either. There would be nothing illegal. They wouldn't have done anything illegal. That was perfectly within their rights because they owned the character of George McFly, and they owned the original footage that I had been paid to act in. And there was just the contracts that were signed, that would have been in their right. What they did not own was my face or me. And they did not pay. They did not come into a contractual agreement with me to use my face or me. And they did. And they took the casts of my face from the original film that were used to make the old age prosthetics, and then they had the makeup artist make my nose and chin and cheekbones to put onto a different actor's face.
Yeah.
So, anyhow, the original question was a more comfortable working on River's Edge, and I was very comfortable playing the character of George McFly. I had that one question about the morality, and then I was, I played the character.
Right.
I'm fine with that. What subsequently happened, of course, that wasn't right. And then there was nothing like that in River's Edge or ever again in my career. Has there ever been anything as really outrageous as what happened in that situation?
Yeah. So with River's Edge, you're moving into a little like I mentioned earlier, sort of using the term grittier, darker territory with these characters and in what's happened. And with Lane, did you enjoy going from you had a duality to George, obviously, with, being able to play the different aspects of him, but going into something like Lane and that intense a situation and dealing with all of that, what kind of experience did that take you back to your Orkley kid kind of, that moment that we were talking about with the suicide, going into this kind of headspace again, or how did you get there with Lane?
No, because the Orkley kid was based on a real person. Actually, River's Edge was also based on real people, but in a very removed way. There wasn't like a specific person that I studied. I had videotape of the actual person that I was playing in the Orkley Kid, and that person had put a gun to his chest and actually shot himself in reality.
Wow.
That's not. He lived though. He lived. The person that it was based on actually recently died for something unrelated. He wasn't that old, but I think he was in his maybe early 60s or something. But he did actually. The real person put a gun to himself and did pull the trigger in an attempted suicide, and then but he did not die. The adaptation of it is that he doesn't actually pull the trigger, and that's so in the Sean Penn version, and that's so in the version that I played. But I knew that was the actuality of the character. So that's something that one ingests into, well, how does one think about the psychology of this? Now, I didn't have that kind of specific information when I was working on River's Edge. What I knew it was based on an incident that the writer had read about in the newspaper. So he did, and I don't know how much research he did. I don't think the characters that the original incident was about were very much like the characters that were written. I think there were a lot of differentiations between the real people and what was written in the screenplay. But it was a well-written screenplay, and so there was a certain kind of dialect to me that seemed apparent that was written into it. I mean, you could read the screenplay and not see that dialect, but I employed a pretty strong, what I would call Californian accent. Somebody else might call it a kind of a valley accent.
Right.
And it felt like the dialogue that was written fit that speaking type. And so, I was essentially playing a dialect that worked well with that character. But it was a different, and I had psychological thought processes that I had invented for myself with the character that were not necessarily written in the screenplay, but that was different from the Orkley Kid, which I had very specific, real understandings of the psychology of the character, who's a very specific person that I was playing, which I would say probably is an even more informed way of working and preferable if you can really be playing something that specific. But
yeah.
But the screenplay for River's Edge was really well written, and the dialogue was really good, and it was well cast, and it was a good working experience. It was shot quickly too. It was shot in 4, at the most 5 weeks, but I think 4.
Wow. Did you, heading into Andy Warhol and the Doors, was it a similar thing to Orkley where you were looking back and did you attach yourself to Andy?
Well, what happened there was I had met Andy Warhol at Madonna and Sean Penn's wedding. And the girl that I was going out with at the time, went up to Andy Warhol and started talking to him. And I of course knew who Andy Warhol was, and I'd read about him and liked him. But she came back over and said, "Oh, Back to the Future just come out." what had happened is after I finished shooting Back to the Future, not immediately, but within a month or so, I went and shot At Close Range in Tennessee with Sean Penn.
Great movie, yeah.
And Christopher Walken. I really enjoyed working on that. And actually, Back to the Future came out while I was in Tennessee. I wasn't able to go to the cast and crew screening, so I Back to the Future came out, and then I came back from Tennessee, and I went to the Cinerama Dome, and I paid to go see the film at the Cinerama Dome. That was the time that I saw it. That's the only time I've ever seen it. In fact, it was when I went to Tennessee. And I was glad I was in the film and all of that. But it was not too long right after that Sean Penn got married to Madonna. And so Andy Warhol, I guess, had just seen Back to the Future. And the girl that I was seeing at the time, like I said, she came up and said, "Oh, yeah, he really liked you and wants to talk to you." So I went up and I talked to him a little bit, and he was very nice. I didn't talk to him too long. But then after I talked to him, I kind of stood back and watched him, and I was thinking he would be a good character to play at some point. And I looked at how he held himself and moved, and then it was, I don't know, within a year or two that I heard there was an Andy Warhol role in the Doors movie, and Andy Warhol recently died, and I had met Oliver Stone on a meeting for Platoon. I had had a very good meeting with him, but it was just a meeting. I didn't read from or anything, but I liked him, but for whatever reason, I wasn't cast in the film. But I had my agents get a hold of him because I knew that there was an Andy Warhol part. I went in and I auditioned for him, and I got the part. So, I did ask some things of Oliver Stone that there were some things that I just asked some lines to be taken away for the Andy Warhol character. All I asked was to cut out certain things. But I liked working on that, and I liked working with Oliver Stone on it. I was concerned, of course, because Andy Warhol is a well-known figure, and I think it can be very difficult especially if an actor is playing an actor, or if they're playing a singer, but particularly an actor, it's almost impossible to make that work, because basically, an actor is well known because of something about that's integral to their person, their being. Yeah. And then another actor is trying to kind of do that element, and it often is, I don't think it's very often successful. Yeah. Now, Warhol is known, of course, as a visual artist as well as other things, but he's known to a certain extent. So I had some concerns about that as well. But I'm very happy that I was the first person to portray Andy Warhol in a feature film.
Yeah, it was great, and that scene was such a. I mean, you talk about fantasy, and it really took the film into this sort of different realm with the character of Jim Morrison, where he was really starting to tip at that point. So it was really pivotal, and you were excellent in that. Were you a Morrison and Doors fan going into the film?
I knew the Doors music, and I like the Doors well enough. I tend toward listening more to classical music, but I like the Doors well enough. But actually, what I was thinking about, I just shot a film this summer, or last year, based on an Elmore Leonard novel called called Freaky Deaky.
Yeah.
And one of the we were shooting a scene. It's also takes place in the 70s as opposed to the 60s, but it has some aspects that I guess are to get a little trippy, so to speak. And we were shooting a scene, and one of the guys that was shooting, who I knew I'd worked with him before, but he said, "Oh, what we worked on before was the Doors film. I shot those shots that were, the camera was kind of like, I guess, like a wide angle that was kind of going up and down and looking around in a handheld way during those scenes with that scene with me and Val Kilmer playing Jim Morrison." And He said we're doing exactly the same shots that we did, and even we were. It was
wow.
kind of I'm playing a totally different character in this movie, but it was it was funny that it was the same camera operator shooting exactly the same sequence with an actor like 20-something years old.
That's wild.
It's a small world in the film community.
So moving on to Dead Man and working with Jim Jarmusch. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I love this film for a number of reasons, and fans of Johnny Depp have, I think, it's been sort of a gateway for them to get into a more less mainstream type cinema, as he's moved into a lot of the more action films and things like that. I think that's really fascinating. Your character, as always, is very memorable in the film. And what was it like working with Jim? Did you find him a kindred spirit in his approach to his cinema?
Some of the films that I've seen again I've seen Orkley Kid. They played Ruben and Ed at the Lincoln Center a couple of years ago. I saw that again. Of course, I've seen What Is It and Everything Is Fine because I co-edited Everything Is Fine and edited What Is It, and I see them at screenings sometimes. And then when Beowulf came out, there were a number of premieres that I went to, so I saw that a few times. The same with Alice in Wonderland. But usually now, unless there's like a big premiere, I actually sometimes don't even see the films. I'll see it when I'm doing the audio, the re-recording for the sound. But kind of unless there's like a big premiere, I often, there's a number of films lately that in the last several years I haven't seen. So I've only seen the Jim Jarmusch film when it came out, whenever that was in the 90s. I think I was sent a DVD or something, or VHS maybe, and I kind of forgotten. I just worked on it one day, but I ran into Jim Jarmusch at a film festival and sat and talked with him, and he's a nice fellow. And he was saying that I had done a lot of improvisation on it, which I'd kind of forgotten about. But I realized in retrospect I did, and I often don't. Usually I go very strictly by the words. It's just the way that I had kind of come into acting. And it's not that I'm against improvisation. Again, I studied improvisation with technique, so I'm very comfortable with it. But I often don't. But in that film, a lot of the dialogue, there was a certain amount of improvisational aspect in it, and Jim Jarmusch was open to that. So I liked working with him.
And then came a film that I think many genre fans have really come to love, and even upon release, is Willard. And I absolutely love you in that film, and it has become one of your most popular films, as I mentioned, among fans. So how did this whole thing happen? I mean, it's kind of an unlikely film to be remade, from Ben, but right. Boy, I think it even trumped the original.
It wasn't remade from Ben. It was remade from Willard.
Willard, yeah. I'm sorry.
It's the sequel to Willard, and the original novel was called. I think its original title was A Rat Man's Notebook, and then the screenwriter wrote the screenplay, Willard. And I did read the book, and it was quite different than the original screenplay of Willard. I'm talking about the 1972 original film.
Right.
And I had not seen Willard, the original movie, until after I was offered the role, and then I wanted to look at it and see if there was something I could glean from the actor who played Willard that would work. And he's a really good actor, and he played the role very well. But the content of the screenplay, the emotional quality of the character was different from. I read the screenplay of the role that I was offered, so I had my initial impression of that. Then later I watched the original film, Willard, and I think then after that I read Ratman's Notebook as well. And but when I watched the character, as much as I thought that the actor was really good, I did not see a similarity into what that character was. I mean, certainly there are topical similarities, but there was an emotional differentiation. So I didn't feel like I could take specifics from Bruce Davidson, what's the name of the actor who played it. And he was excellent, but I couldn't utilize something from his performance because it was quite a different emotional makeup in the screenplay that I read.
And the film obviously involved one of the things that everyone talks about, famously, what are the things you don't work with in film, and animals are one of those things, and just the sheer quantity of all the mice and rats that you were dealing with in the film. Were you comfortable dealing with them?
Yeah, that wasn't a problem. I don't have a fear of rats, but that's also, it looks like I'm dealing with more rats than I actually am. Mostly what I was dealing with were the white rats that were very well trained, and then the one large Gambian pouch rat, which actually I think technically is not, I don't think it's a rodent. I think that's a marsupial. Huh. But I got conflicting information. It was a heavy animal. That was like heavier than a cat, but a beautiful animal at the same time. But most of my work was really with the white rats. There was one shot where I had some brown rats. I think I had 3 brown rats on my shoulders.
Yes.
And it was used as, those are the only animals other than the white rats that I ever had on me. And that's when I'm coming out of the elevator, much of which was enhanced by, of course, by CGI. And then there were just a few rats that remain. But all of the rats were, well, particularly the white rats, were exceedingly well trained. I also worked with a dog and a cat in the film. The rats were by far, far, far easier to work with than the dog or the cat. And the reason is because a dog and a cat, if you think about it, these are animals that have been bred by humans for, genetically selected over however many thousands of years or more, millions perhaps with dogs. Maybe I don't know I'm sure there's a number somewhere, but dogs have been a long time and cats came in a bit later. But these animals have been bred to be domesticated, pets that are there essentially for the enjoyment and servitude to their human captors and owners. And so what do they have to do essentially, particularly a cat or even a small toy dog, is do anything. They just have to kind of wag their tail and look like they like their owners. And they may very well like their owners. But in any case, that's all they need to do to survive. A rat, on the other hand, has to scurry for food. It has to find patterns to know where the food is going to be, and it has to escape in certain situations. So a rat is actually, it's a feral animal, or can be, but it also can be relatively domesticated. And it can be trained because it has to scurry for its food to do very exacting things. So, like, for example, one scene that I had, which was an emotional scene, and this was what I was most concerned with for the character, was the emotional aspects. For me, most things are relatively easy to access, like getting upset, getting irritated, getting, uncomfortable, or getting happy. All of those things are relatively easy to access. But getting to the point of being sad, truly sad, tearfully sad, which was written into the screenplay, I'm by nature, I'm not a depressive person. I'm not a sad person, and it's very difficult for me in my life to get to the point of true tearfulness. Something an acting teacher said to me when I was studying acting that I always thought about and remembered was it's much better to have a little bit, just a little bit of true emotion than a lot of fake emotion. I totally agree with. Now, and so when I was talking to Glenn Morgan about it, the writer-director, there were scenes that were written that had it written about tearfulness in it. I felt it was very important that I discuss it with him because if it came to the point where on the day, for whatever reason, I was only a little bit sad, and I wasn't sad to the point of tearfulness, that it was better that I was just at that point of whatever was a true sadness. And he said, yeah, no, I totally agree. Don't worry about that. I wrote, this tearful element just for, the people that were reading the screenplay to get an idea across, which was very good for me because then I wasn't concerned about the physicality of the tears, but I was able to get into the mindset of the character, and then when the tearfulness actually did happen, then it was organically there for the right reasons, and it worked. Now I started to go into that because many of the scenes I had that were tearful scenes were scenes with these white rats, and they were genuine acting partners that had to do specific motions, and if those motions were not exactingly done, I would have had to do all kinds of takes, and it's hard to get to that, for me, to get to that point of concentration where that's true and organic. And but those rats never once ever made a mistake, not once during the entire time we were filming.
Wow.
So one example of it, they had 2 rats trained for I have a suicide scene where I'm going into my father's room, and he'd killed himself, and in this script, and I have a white rat, Socrates, on my shoulder, and in the scene I take out these things that were in my father's desk, and it's a pocket knife, and I go to open my vein to kill myself, and then the rat runs down my arm and basically gets me to stop me from killing myself with the knife. So there were 2 rats that were trained. One rat was trained to sit, only to sit. That's all it did. And it was trained to do that. Another rat was the scurrying rat that was trained specifically to go run down the arm and to hit the point where the knife was placed to the wrist. And that's all it was trained. It had been trained for months and months to do this. So what had to happen was we got to the point, and it's an emotional scene. We just discussed it beforehand. We said, all right, what the cut will be is that I'll get to the point of where the knife is in my wrist, and then we won't cut, but the trainer would come in with the animal, take off the sitting Socrates rat and put in the scurrying Socrates rat that goes down to the wrist. And the camera would just keep rolling, and I would basically, freeze. And then there would be a cutaway for that quick second, and then the take would continue. We did 2 takes, and both times each rat did it perfectly, and It worked really well. That would have been very difficult if I had to deal with with the dogs. I remember, it wasn't an emotional scene with the dog, but we had a dog in some kind of suitcase or something, and it was supposed to bark or something. It never did. I don't think it ever did what they had did. But but the rats were perfect.
Wow, that's interesting. And then continuing in the genre vein came one that actually kind of surprised me when I saw it when it came out, was Simon Says, where you played the brothers Simon and Stanley in that. It's such an over-the-top type film. What did you find in the script for this?
Well, I mean, often people ask, why did you choose to work in a particular film? Is there a particular reason you did it? I mean, I was touring with my films, I'm forgetting exactly what year it was, but I was essentially still recouping on my films. If you look at the time period between the year 2000 and 2010, this is really the most I've worked in my entire career. And the reason was I needed to pay for my films. So I worked as much as I possibly could. This was a part. I opened up the script. I essentially knew when I opened up the script, I wanted to make sure that it would work because I needed to work. And it struck me that this screenplay was written essentially as a comedy. It felt to me very much, there were punchlines, there were jokes. It was, I didn't see it written as a scary movie. I mean, we were talking earlier about Friday the 13th and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The structure is essentially exactly the same as that structure, where you have young people that get kind of in a secluded area, and then some kind of psychotic person wants to kill them, and that's essentially what Texas Chainsaw Massacre is, what Friday the 13th is, and what Simon Says is. The difference is I'm playing, these two psychologies. It was not written as a true psychological study of these characters. It was not written as it was written, as you said, I think you said, it was written broadly. It was written, like I say, as, to me, it struck me as a comedy. I don't really see how it could be played as a serious psychological understanding of this particular character. It was just, it just wasn't written that way. So I had to play that which was written. Now, there's a thing called play comedy like tragedy and tragedy like comedy, but it's a funny juxtaposition of genres, because you don't, sometimes there's such a thing as a horror comedy, but often I believe the film was probably sold as a horror film, slasher film, whatever, but I don't know if that's the correct way to really look at it, at least not from my perspective. Now, that's one of the films that I've never seen the entire film. I saw it when I was doing the sound for it, and I could see essentially, how it played and worked. I did have a fun time playing the character or characters. They were fun characters to play, and there was fun dialogue to say. But that's really my thoughts about it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of what people consider to be horror films really aren't so much horror. I think that, as you identified earlier, there are people who go for the gore element or something like that, where that is what then allows it to be classified as a horror film. But I agree that, especially as people transition into adulthood, that when you're a kid, what scares you isn't the same as when you're an adult, and so you go to see these things for that fun aspect, for the over the top. And Simon Says is that way, where it just gets more insane as it goes with, the audacity of what you're using to take care of these teenagers, throughout the whole thing. The big rolling pickaxe, bit that you had in there, and so yeah, I think it's interesting that you approached it from the perspective of it almost being a comedy, because that really is how it is for the viewer as an experience.
Yeah, I mean, again, there is that adage of play comedy like tragedy and tragedy like comedy. So I wouldn't say that I was playing it necessarily as comedy, but in the way that you play comedy like tragedy, that is what I mean.
Yeah.
But like a horror, like when doing the role, I did not think that this was a character or film that would genuinely make people afraid. That's what it struck me as, and I don't know what the film actually plays like really. I'm assuming it plays as funny, but I'm not exactly certain.
Yeah, it's one of those that's so over the top that it goes from even the tension. There's some levity to the tension even because of how over the top it is with the blood. And obviously, I'm sure that it's mostly CG what we're seeing in there, but it's a fun film. It really is. It's certainly, I don't think it's out of place in your canon. It was just an interesting aside.
It was a fun character to play, and I particularly the Stanley character was fun because it actually is relatively different than the kind of characters I often play. It's a more gruff kind of character than I'll often play.
Then the Wizard of Gore. Had you seen the original film?
No, it was another one where they came to me. I had not seen the original film, and then after the business was worked out that I was going to be in it, I watched the original film to see if there was something that would make sense to glean from the character. But again, like in Willard, it was a different kind of character than what would the screenplay that I read was different from the screenplay that was in the original.
Yeah, it is very different. It's a real departure, but your character in it is really fun. The way that you handled it, and it's. I don't know that it would be classified as a horror film, although it's released as such, with a saw blade on the cover of it and things like that. But what was the experience like working on this? Again, I think it was probably a lower budget picture for you. Am I correct? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was fun. I liked the character. It was a fun character to play. They shot my stuff, I think, in the first week of shooting, which is always a really nice time to shoot because, especially on low-budget films, I've noticed it's like the third week. If there's ever going to be trouble, if like people get grumpy or whatever, it's basically on week 3.
Sure.
So week 1, everybody's like fresh, and I shot all of my stuff was shot in the first week of shooting, and I enjoyed it. I liked working with the director. I liked all of these films that we're talking about actually were fun characters to play. Willard, Wizard of Gore, and Simon Says. There is something rich, and it does have something to do with the horror genre. There's kind of a large dynamic that can be fun to play with, and all of these characters were fun characters to play.
How much of what you did to these girls on the stage in there were you actually dealing with props as opposed to CG done in post?
I haven't studied this film carefully. I saw it when we were doing when I did the voice work, and I did a fair amount of voice work for it. I think all of the scenes I saw that I was in, I did voice work for all of it, but I'm not recollecting what was CGI versus what was actual props. I know that I know while shooting it, I was dealing with some insides at one point, where I don't know if that's in the film or not. I know some things were cut out and some things were left in, but it wasn't particularly it's the title is Wizard of Gore. It didn't seem particularly I didn't feel like I was particularly overly involved with a lot of gore, so to speak. It was something the original film that I thought was quite effective, actually. It looked to me, I don't know for sure, but it looked to me like whatever they were using, I'm assuming it wasn't human, but it looked like they had some kind of actual organs from an animal that they were, like a cow or something that they were playing with, and it gave it a particularly visceral quality that was tangible in the original movie. And whatever I was working with was, rubber.
Yeah. The first film was part of a trilogy of films from the same director and they were all like that, where the blood is a really deep, rich red, and there's a lot of it, and a lot of entrails and things. Didn't
it look like the organs that they were using? To me, it looked like it was. I don't think those were fake organs. I think those were real animal organs, not human organs, but like from a cow or sheep or something. And then they did stuff to make it look like it was from a person. I've never read that. That's the visual aspect that it had to me. Probably, if that was so, maybe they're not supposed to do that. Maybe the director would never have said it. But that is what it looked like to me. It looks very like it was real organs.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's part of what makes those films so effective.
Probably, yeah. Well, there was another thing that made the original film effective, which I asked them after I watched it. I said I thought it would be good to bring these aspects into it. I theorize that I've never met David Cronenberg, but my favorite David Cronenberg film is I'm forgetting the title, Videodrome.
Okay.
And there's an aspect to the original Wizard of Gore which has to do with kind of reality being broken into a different reality. And that, to me, was what was really, when I watched the film, this was after I'd, agreed to be in the movie, this was what was effective about the screenplay of the original Wizard of Gore. And after I saw it, I said I thought it would be good to focus more on that stuff, which didn't seem to me that it was brought so much into the version that I was in. But I theorize that looking at Videodrome, I would assume it would make sense that David Cronenberg would be somebody who would have been influenced by watching Herschel Gordon Lewis movies. And I would think, as opposed to the Gore aspect of it, there's something about Videodrome that is reminiscent of that non-reality within non-reality and things having to do with television. I see that maybe as a young filmmaker, as a young man, perhaps David Cronenberg had quite liked the original Wizard of Gore, and somewhere in his psyche when he was writing Videodrome, there might have been some play on that theme. Yes, I mean, you might ask David Cronenberg someday, and he may say, no, I never even saw that film. Because I've had people do that to me. They'll say, oh, well, what is it? It was obviously influenced by this, this, and this, and they're films that I've never even seen. So things, you never know where something's coming from. But I saw that as being a very interesting aspect of the original Wizard of Gore, and I like the element of the non-reality building upon the non-reality.
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier that I would sort of like to close on with. You're saying that when a director or production comes to you to play a role, they're coming to you for something that you bring with you to the screen. What do you think you bring that so many directors and producers and casting agents have found over the years? What is it that you bring?
Well, it depends. Sometimes, like I just had this happen on this film that I did in the summer. Sometimes it's well known that you're not the first choice. Sometimes you can. I think I was a later choice for this film that I just did in Freaky Deaky.
Oh, William Macy was going to play the role, I think, right?
Although yeah. I feel like they. It actually seems unlikely that there would have been a contract that would have been made up. I get the feeling it's more likely. I've met William Macy a number of times. He's an excellent actor and a nice fellow, so I've conversed with him, but I haven't run into him since I played that part. I'll have to ask him if I run into him again. But I would assume that there was never a contractual element, that probably what happened was that the producers were just being a little bit overly zealous. It wasn't just my character. It's like every single character was supposedly cast with a different person, which is a strange way of going about publicity. You have a contract with people. But at the same time, I can see, even, if I'm not that similar to William Macy, there are aspects to what the character was that it did make sense for me to play the character. Although I had to think about it. I was in the middle of touring, and there were a weird series of things that happened right before I ended up doing that, where I had been offered a different movie. And I had basically agreed to, which is not usual for me, I had agreed to do the film, and I had not looked at it really carefully enough, and there was something I misread in the screenplay. And when I got on the phone with the director, he made me realize something that was I could not justify it psychologically for the character. And I knew that other actors would not see it as a psychological flaw. And I just said to him really frankly, I wasn't angry or anything. I was apologetic, but I just said, I really think it's better if you get another actor to do it, because I will know this when I'm playing the role, and I won't be the best person to play the part because of it. And there'll be another actor that won't be thinking about this. Luckily, they were okay. They were nice, and they did get a different actor. And actually, even in that situation, that was still one where I was kind of replacing somebody that I guess had dropped out. So, but then it was like 2 days. They had been interested in me for this Freaky Deaky film, and I was almost going to do this film, and then I didn't do that film, and then they were still coming at me, and I was kind of like, I was tired from touring, and I don't like to turn work down. But I wasn't really that anxious, and there were certain aspects about the character. I'd been offered a number of characters that had certain things over the past year that I was concerned about, and this character in Freaky Deaky had, when I first looked at it, tinges of what I was concerned about. But actually, the offer went way, way up, and it was after I turned this other thing down, and then I looked at it, because when the offer went up, I thought, well, I really better look at this carefully. And I read it, and it was based on a William Leonard novel. Elmore Leonard novel, and there was depth to it. And I I had not looked at it as carefully because I was in the middle of touring with my films and shows. It was really a great character to get to play. But what they were coming to me for, it changes from film to film. On some level, they needed a body. They needed something. And I was luckily I was right for the part, and it was a really good part to play, and I had a very good time working on it. But it depends from film to film. You never know exactly what it is that somebody's after you for. I'm assuming different directors are interested in different things about me when I'm working on something.
Is it sort of verboten to have that discussion with casting directors or anybody in production, the course of production, or have you ever been in a situation where once you got into the film and you were in with the production, you thought, well, geez, how did they see me in this character? How did they see me in this?
No, no, I've never had it happen where I felt, how did they see me in this? Something I heard, which I very much believe in. I don't remember exactly where I heard it. Maybe it was in an acting class. But there's a real truth in it, is that once you're cast in a character, you are it. Meaning there is, sure, there's always the possibility that somebody could be replaced. When I was working on Back to the Future, Eric Stoltz, we didn't really talk about that aspect, but I shot for 6 weeks with a completely different actor playing, the main character of the film. I had shot most of my role with a different actor, and then he was replaced. So it does happen. It's very rare. That's the only time I've ever experienced it in my career. But essentially, when you're playing a character, you are it, and nobody wants to get rid of you. Even if you weren't very good, they still don't want to get rid of you. The production, they want the thing to be going along. So on some level, you just have to. You just do it. And you there is no other option. You are it. It's actually, I think it's a good way to think about it, because what else is there?
Yeah.
So no, I've never had that. I've never had that feeling. Like William Macy's a great actor. I like him personally, and he would have been really good in this part. I have no doubt. But I had no thought about feeling like, it wasn't right for me to play the part. And like I say, I actually don't think he probably never had a contract for it. But I was perfectly comfortable and felt like I was very right for the part, and I never had any second thoughts about it. Because again, a production, it's on some level it's a business. There's a business as much as there's an artistic aspect. There's a business aspect, and you just got to go in and you've got to do it. You've got to do a good job. That's all there is to it.
And I really appreciate everything. It means the world, and it's a great pleasure to have chatted with you today. And I look forward to seeing you again.
All right, you too. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
You bet. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
What an incredible conversation with Crispin. For him to be so transparent, so open about everything with his career over the years is, just the most tremendous honor, and I hope you enjoyed that. You can follow me at justinbeahm.com or reverendentertainment.com. I'm on all social media. Just look up my name, Justin Beahm, Beahm. And I'm happy to hear from you as well. So please don't be shy about sending me a message, comments, any kind of requests for this. Before we dive out here, I do want to get into the voicemails that have been left for this episode. My topic for this one was what are your favorite theatrical experiences, which just really means tell me about the nights that you best remember about going to the theater and seeing something in person. So let's dive in on that first message coming to us right now.
Hey, Justin, my favorite theatrical experience came in the fall of 2001 when I was a senior in high school, and a friend and I were, I'm going to start that over. I forgot to introduce myself. Sorry. Hey, Justin, this is David from Menominee Falls, Wisconsin, and my favorite theatrical experience came when I was a senior in high school in 2001, and a friend and I were going to make it a double feature at the dollar movie night at our budget cinema. We walked in, we gave them our dollar. We said, we want to see whatever movie's starting next. And the next movie that happened to start was Christopher Nolan's Memento. And going into that movie, completely spoiler-free, not having a hint of what was going on, was an amazing experience, let alone getting to see it for $1. We walked out of the theater, minds blown, felt like we should go back in and watch it again. Actually opted to go see The Mummy Returns. Slightly less thrilling experience, but nonetheless, my favorite theatrical experience ever.
David, thank you so much for calling in. What an incredible experience seeing Memento, especially if you had no idea what you were heading into. A true masterstroke from Christopher Nolan. It's a film that I've heard cited over and over again throughout the years as I've interviewed various people as a point of inspiration. I remember Scott Beck and Brian Woods in particular making note of Memento's influence on them and their cinema. So a great story. Thank you so much for sharing.
Hey, Justin. Scotty from Fun with Horror. My favorite movie theater experience, I've got 3 for you. Number 1, when I was a kid and Ghostbusters came out, I was in Pensacola, Florida, and they had a guy dressed up as a Ghostbuster and a little fake ghost that just traveled down this line, down the aisle of the theater before the show. It was probably really cheesy and hokey, but you know, when I was that young, it was so much fun. Number 2, when I was spending my summers out in LA before I moved here, I was here the summer of Batman 1989, and I remember I saw the movie on opening night, but after that, one day my uncle dropped me off at Universal Studios, and I went on the Universal Studios tour and then went up to the AMC theaters and proceeded to get tickets to see Batman twice in a row. And it was so much fun just by myself, having a great time as a young teenage kid. That was a good time. And then number 3, I'd have to say, strangely, one that's very memorable is Open Water, the kind of low budget movie about the 2 divers stranded in the middle of the ocean. And I just remember that movie, I've never seen it since then, but I was so filled with anxiety during that movie that I almost left the theater simply out of fear and because I didn't think my heart could take it. And I'll never forget that theater experience. I should probably watch that movie again to see how it holds up after all this time, but I've never ever felt that in the theater before and never since. So those are my 3. Love you, brother. Bye-bye.
Scotty, Fun with Horror, thank you so much for calling in. Oh my gosh, Ghostbusters. You've really taken me back here. Ghostbusters, seeing that in theaters was a huge moment for me as well. Not even close, though, was Batman 1989. That remains a cornerstone theatrical experience for me, and the videotape as well. That was a huge thing when it came out because it was the first movie on tape that I ever asked for. And I remember that being the moment on Christmas that year. I'll never forget opening up that tape and the joy that came with it. These are 2 cornerstone films for so many people, Scotty, and it absolutely was the same for me. That sent me on the path with Tim Burton that continues to this day, and Ghostbusters continuing with these newer films, just amazing. As far as Open Water goes, that's a film that I remember kind of escaping me on initial release, but I did catch it on video. absolutely harrowing, but it was the sequel that really hit me the hardest. That's the one where Open Water 2 features a couple who end up outside their boat. There's a baby on board, and they are outside and completely unable to get on board to take care of that child. That to me is the nightmare scenario as a dad, thinking about not being able to get to my child when they need me the most is a nightmare that plagues me in so many ways to this day. So the open water films, I think, are just wonderful and great inclusion on this list here today. Thank you, Scotty, again for calling in. I really appreciate it.
JB from Justin Beam's Radio Hour. This is Greg Mortis from Land of Creeks, man, calling in about theatrical experiences. I got two, and they're both non-horror. The first one would have been E.T. in 1982, a young 10-year-old me going to the theater with my parents and crying my eyes out. Y'all know what scene I'm talking about. Absolutely, and just amazed at how beautiful that movie was and still is. One of my all-time favorites. And the second one was kindergarten 5-year-old me going to the field trip that we had in kindergarten. And we ended up going to see Sinbad, the Eye of the Tiger. And oh my gosh, man, being blown away with Ray Harryhausen and just seeing the effects and what that movie did for me, man, was just loving cinema at a 5-year-old age, seeing what they could do on screen. I was just amazed. And if I recall, I think there was even a little bit of booby in that movie. So 5-year-old me was shocked. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. But anyways, that's my call, man. Love you, Justin. Hope the show goes great. And all the other callers, I'm sure, will do great. But we love you. See you. Bye. Pearl and I out. Peace.
Gregor Mortis, LOTC. I have to say, E.T. in 1982 is one of the early theatrical experiences that I remember as well. For me, not only was the movie great, but most poignantly, I remember it being the only film that made my dad cry. I can't think of another time where my dad shed tears and I got to witness it. But very clearly remember when we're sitting in the car outside the theater after seeing E.T. for the first time. It was me, my brother Mitch, and my dad. And my dad went to start the car and just sort of sat there for a moment, tears streaming down his face. And that was a moment of vulnerability that I had never been exposed to before. It's extremely rare with him at all, period, over time. But it's something that I look back on and treasure because of how open he felt in that moment and because of how that film resonated with him. And then on to Sinbad and Ray Harryhausen's work. I mean, oh my gosh, there's no way to overstate the towering influence Harryhausen had on cinema and continues to have to this day. Incredible experience that you had there. I'm super jealous of. And man, thank you so much, Mortis, for sharing.
Hey, Justin, it's Josh. So I figured I'd give you a call and share mine with you. Now, the first little bit is just the entire time of seeing Star Wars The Force Awakens, being a gigantic nerd and, you know, at various times on the verge of tears throughout, just because seeing Star Wars, you know, as a big kid as opposed to just being a kid, it was pretty cool. But I wanted to share a little bit just about a time that I got to go to a movie with you, actually, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into, was when we went to see Grindhouse when that came out. You asked if I wanted to go. I was going in completely blind, had no idea about the trailers. This was very early in my exploration of cinema that wasn't necessarily mainstream. And even though, you know, it's Tarantino and Rodriguez, I was hooked right from the beginning. You know, the trailers were spectacular. And just the entire vibe in a full theater in Davenport, Iowa was just, it's a night that I can still, hearken back to. And it brings back really fond memories, and it's kind of one of those feelings that you're always hoping to get when you go to a movie. You know, I was close with the Ghostbusters Afterlife, kind of close to getting there, but nothing like that Grindhouse, just knowing nothing going in. So anyhow, sorry I went on a little bit, but yeah, Grindhouse in Davenport, Iowa, getting to see that with you was pretty amazing. So catch you later.
Josh Luce calling in. Star Wars, Force Awakens. I think for a lot of fans of the Star Wars universe, that was a monumental moment. It's so incredible. But for me, just like you, Grindhouse, unforgettable. We went to the theater that night and saw the entire experience, and it was so overwhelming in its greatness. I remember going back a number of times. I think I saw that probably 3 or 4 nights in a row, just because I kind of assumed that it was not going to be making the money it should. And I'm sure I had a short window to experience that. I was totally overwhelmed with everything that was presented there, where you have Tarantino, you have Eli Roth, you have Rob Zombie. There's so many people pouring into this thing. The trailer's completely unexpected. It was a true masterstroke in unexpected delivery, where the trailers for this thing had no indication of what was in store for us. And it was a truly treasured night on my end as well. And I'm so glad that you went with me, because I know it wasn't something that you were particularly keen on taking part in. But man, so excited to have seen that, and treasured memories on my end as well.
Hey, Justin, this is Dave Becker from the DVD Infatuation podcast and the blog. Also, Dr. Shock on Land of the Creeps. And I'm calling about your upcoming episode for theatrical experiences. My theatrical experience, the most memorable for me, goes back to June of 1981. It was my brother's 10th birthday. I was 11 at the time. And we were celebrating his birthday. We were all going to the theater to see Dragon Slayer. That was the movie we wanted to see. And we piled into the car. I was in the front seat with my father, and my brother and a group of our friends were in the back seat. And I remember pulling up to the theater and my father looking up at the marquee, and he let out an expletive sort of under his breath. And that caused me to look up at the marquee. And what I did not see was Dragon Slayer on the marquee. He had taken us to the wrong theater. But I could tell by his demeanor that he wanted to get us out of his car as quickly as he could. It was literally my brother and myself and maybe 4 or 5 of my friends, our friends, piled into the back seat. So I said, let's just go see the movie that's playing here. And I remember some of my friends were like, no, we want to see Dragon Slayer. We don't want to see this movie. Even my brother was kind of like apprehensive. He was like, no, I want to see Dragon Slayer. And my father turned around and said to them, guys, you're going to see the movie that's playing here. Get out. So he tossed us out of the car. The only thing I knew about the movie that was playing at this theater was a 15-second commercial that I had seen that involved a boulder rolling down a hill. That's the only thing I knew about it going into the theater. Well, the movie was Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I remember sitting there in the theater when it started, that whole opening sequence where Indiana Jones is trying to get that idol. I'm assuming in South America. That whole sequence, I was mesmerized. It literally mesmerized me as I was sitting there watching it. The moment that the plane in Raiders of the Lost Ark flew into the sunset. That whole sequence where Indiana Jones gets into the plane and he's like, "There's a snake in the plane, Jacques." And Jacques' like, "Oh, that's my pet snake, Reggie." He's like, "I hate snakes, Jacques. I hate them. Oh, show a little backbone, will you?" That, when the plane flew in the distance, that is the moment I fell in love with the movies. It was the thing, from that point forward, I wanted to know who made the movie. I learned everything I could about Steven Spielberg. I wanted to know how he did certain things in the film. And I watched all of the making of specials that I could find on Raiders of the Lost Ark. It literally became my favorite movie. It's so funny because this is in the days before, home video. My parents did not believe in seeing a movie more than once. They thought if you saw a movie once, that's it. You don't have to see it again. I pestered them so much that my mother finally said to my father, "Oh, for God's sakes, just take him to see Raiders of the Lost Ark again." They didn't want to hear me again. So I got to see that movie twice. I actually got to see that movie 3 times on the big screen because after they took me the second time, my next door neighbor at the time had come over and said, "Hey, I really want to see Raiders of the Lost Ark, but my wife won't go to see it with me. Is it okay if I bring your sons with me?" And I immediately was like, "Yes." So I got to see it 3 times on the big screen, which was, unheard of in my household at the time. But anyway, that original viewing of Raiders of the Lost Ark in June of 1981, that is my most memorable theatrical experience. Keep up the great work, my friend, and I will talk with you soon. Take care.
Dr. Shock, LOTC, you're turning back the clock to June 1981 in Dragon Slayer. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that film. It sounds like you didn't actually maybe see that theatrically, but please do call in and let me know what you ended up thinking when you saw that movie. But Raiders of the Lost Ark, I mean, come on. Steven Spielberg, just an incredible experience for so many people and a cornerstone film for so many filmmakers over time that I've talked to. What a great story about you accidentally ending up in the seat and bearing witness to that movie. That's absolutely incredible. I've heard a lot of stories about Spielberg over the years, and of course his influence, we don't need to dive into that because it's been explored ad nauseum. But what I will say is that the people who have fallen in love with Spielberg's cinema, and this ties in actually to Crispin as well, of course, the people who have fallen in love with Spielberg's cinema seem to want to go on to touch part of that universe themselves. I don't think I've met anyone who had a passive investment in film after seeing and being truly hit by a Spielberg film that didn't want to try their hand at it in some way or another. So it's no surprise that you ended up with LOTC and all of the film work that you've done and the different podcasts and your blog. Incredible. Thank you, Dave, for calling in.
Hi, Justin. This is Joel Sainz. My favorite theatrical movie experience was Halloween Resurrection. I saw it at the Brownsville, Pennsylvania Drive-In Theater with my mom. It was the last movie I saw with her. At that time, she was legally blind, and I remember describing the movie frame by frame to her, and I'll always cherish that memory. Thank you. I always enjoy listening to the show, and best of luck.
Jules, Halloween Resurrection. Wow. I remember seeing H2O in the theater at a press screening in Chicago. And this is actually one of the movies that I would cite as one of my favorite theatrical experiences, where it was completely unexpected. I had no idea what was to come, intentionally so. But I ended up getting press tickets to go see the movie again in Chicago. Ended up in this massive theater still to this day, outside of maybe the Chinese theater in Los Angeles, as the biggest theater that I've ever been in. And that movie rolling out in front of this huge audience of devoted fans, the moment in H2O where Jamie drops the keys, where Laurie drops the keys, and all of a sudden she looks up, and at that door is the face of Michael Myers. That moment drew hysterical applause and cheers from everyone in the room. It was absolutely amazing and unforgettable. That moment alone cemented my H2O experience. But then on to Resurrection, which came pretty quickly afterwards, after H2O. And going to see that was a treat as well, because it was like, well, where could this possibly go? There was that beautiful twist at the end of H2O that I thought I had figured out. As we drove away from the theater, I remember saying to my partner at that time, I was like, I think they probably switched the bodies on that. And she was like, you think? And I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure. Going to see Resurrection, it was just a moment of not only excitement about having figured that twist out, but that was a real experience in a new direction for a franchise. My favorite sequence in that picture is when Michael ends up encountering the sort of John Wayne Gacy obsessive fan that's at the mental institution, and he's wearing the clown mask. And as Michael hands him the knife and makes his way down that corridor out of the shot, there's this music coming into play, and this guy starts rattling off the statistics about what Michael has done, sort of reviewing the body count of his hero. There are very few moments in the Halloween franchise that achieve that level of true intensity and emotional gravity. So I completely get that. And I also want to point out on this one that while I was at Trancas Films working with the Halloween stuff online and in new media and licensing and whatever, I encountered Darnell Weeks, who's a huge fan. He goes online on YouTube as MyersFan25, and he is a devoted fan of this movie, Resurrection. I once did just sort of a personal commentary conversation with Darnell one year, and I think it was after his birthday, where we just watched the movie together. And I got to hear his thoughts as the film played out. He had lots of questions about the people that were involved, and it was a thrilling experience to find someone who found that as their point of entry into the franchise, because that's something that we really need to keep in check, is that no matter what you love about a movie, about a franchise or a genre, everybody has put their toe into the water for the first time at their own time, at their own moment, and with their own film. And with Darnell, for example, it was Halloween Resurrection. It's a movie that is rather polarizing because it's kind of the one that steered the franchise into a more sort of Jason Voorhees direction, I guess you could say. Plus there's Busta Rhymes and the whole online social media aspect to it that was very controversial when it came out. But really, you really need to consider the fact that everybody encounters this stuff for the first time at some point, and it's likely not to necessarily intersect with yours. So Resurrection is a great lesson in that for me, with you, Jules, and with Darnell, and others that I've encountered over the years that count this as a crucial moment for their interest, not only in Halloween, but in the horror genre as a whole. So I really appreciate you calling in and sharing that story with me. Several other theatrical experiences come to mind when thinking about this from my side of things. The first would be going to see Scream in theaters with my friend Shane Bundy in Peoria, Illinois. I have never been in a theater as rowdy as that theater every time we went to it. Shane and I were devotees of the Fangoria chopping list every month in the magazine, and we would try to get through as many of those titles as we could track down. We also loved going to the movies with something new when it landed, and Scream was, of course, prime territory. When I hit play to this day on my Scream 4K or Blu-ray, I am instantly transported back to that very first screening when Shane and I settled down and watched it with a totally rowdy audience in Peoria who were buying into the whole thing, talking back to the screen and laughing and screaming, just like every producer, director, writer, actor would hope would be the case at the end of creating such a thing. So the Scream experience with Shane was precious to me. Another one would be High Tension. There was a theater that had just opened in Moline, Illinois, when I lived there. And this was probably late 90s, I want to say, maybe early 2000s. Yeah, I think maybe early 2000s is more like it. A theater had just opened, and on the first weekend they were there, I wanted to go see something. I didn't care what it was. Most keenly, of course, tuned into horror, and the only horror picture playing was this unknown thing called High Tension. I had no idea what I was in for when I sat down for that screening on that first night. There was probably only a dozen people in the theater. I'm not sure what happened with the marketing on that, but it certainly hadn't been loud enough to have captured my attention prior to that. But man, was I glad to have been there, because the experience was absolutely overwhelming. At the end of the film, which has only happened a couple times, I can think maybe The Witch, the Eggers film that came out many years later, would be maybe the second experience like this, where once the credits started rolling, the theater was in absolute silence. Nobody had anything to say, no laughter, no murmuring. It was just silently shuffling out of the room, and I was enthralled. I was so blown away by that I could not wait for High Tension to hit video. I think I saw it again in theaters maybe one more time before it left, which wasn't long after. And then, of course, when the DVD and eventual Blu-rays hit, the recent release that I think I mentioned on a previous episode landed, that, man, this remains one of my most treasured, not only movie-going experiences, but just one of my favorite films of the last 20 years or so. You could find me online at justinbeahm.com. That's Beahm. Like I mentioned earlier, please do subscribe to that mailing list on my website, where you can always get an email alert whenever I put a new post up about latest release news, special feature news relating to the podcast here. It is truly the best way to stay in touch. You can always contact me through social media as well. I would love to hear from you and appreciate your feedback on the show, and that includes you leaving a rating, whether it's on iTunes or wherever you may listen to it, and also subscribing wherever you can, including over on YouTube, where I'm throwing up the new episodes, and very shortly we'll have all of the historical episodes as well. So thank you so much for dialing in this week. I know it was a long episode. I certainly hope you think it was worthwhile, because I think this is a crucial historical artifact in the world of cinema with Crispin. And I look forward very much to connecting with you again on the next episode. I'll talk to you then.
You have been listening to the Justin Beahm Radio Hour. The Radio Hour is a production of Reverend Entertainment, copyright 2024. All rights reserved.